In the scorching heat of the Arizona territory, a simple farmer tends to his withering crops. His weathered hands tell a story of honest work, but his eyes hold secrets that even the desert winds dare not whisper. The bandits riding toward his land are about to learn that some men are best left alone, no matter how easy a target they might seem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Rattler gang's approach kicked up dust devils across the parched earth of Thunder Valley. Their leader, Marcus the Viper Valencia, sat atop his midnight stallion, a custom-made silver-plated revolver glinting at his hip. The morning sun cast long shadows behind the 12 riders as they made their way through the narrow canyon pass, their reputation preceding them like a dark cloud. The Viper adjusted his blood-red bandana, his scarred face betraying years of violence. Beside him rode his younger brother, Lucas Quick Draw Valencia, whose nervous trigger finger had earned him both his nickname and a body count that rivaled his brother's. The rest of the gang followed in formation, each member chosen for their particular brand of cruelty. Apache territories dried up, the Viper announced, his voice carrying the rasp of too many cigarettes and too much whiskey. Time to expand our hunting grounds. He pulled out a worn map, pointing to a cluster of settlements marked in red ink. Salvation's Creek, small enough to be vulnerable, big enough to be worth our while. Quick Draw spat tobacco juice into the dust. Heard they got some new settlers there, farmers trying to work this godforsaken land. His laugh was sharp and cruel. Easy pickings. The gang's newest member, a young man known only as Coyote, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He joined the Rattlers 3 months ago, drawn by tales of easy money and adventure. The reality had proven far bloodier than the stories. Maybe we should stick to the stage routes, he suggested, immediately regretting speaking up as the Viper's cold eyes fixed upon him. You getting soft on us, boy? The Viper's hand casually moved to his gun belt. Remember what happened to the last man who questioned my decisions? The gang fell silent, remembering the body they'd left hanging from a Joshua tree last month. Coyote swallowed hard and shook his head. Good, the Viper continued, turning back to address the group. Salvation's Creek has no telegraph office, no railway. Just scared settlers and whatever savings they've brought with them. We hit them hard, fast, and vanish into the Diablos Mountains before any law can respond. As they rode, the Viper detailed his plan. They would start with the outlying farms, using the terror they created to soften up the town proper. Each raid would serve as a message, pay protection money, or face the consequences. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before. Word is, there's one farm doing better than the others, Quickdraw added, checking his ammunition. Some stubborn old man who won't sell out. Even in this drought, his crops are holding on. Must have a water source he ain't sharing. The Viper's eyes narrowed. Then that's where we start. Nothing breaks a town's spirit like watching their success stories burn. They made camp as the sun set, the desert coming alive with the sounds of nocturnal predators. Around the campfire, the gang shared stories of their past raids, each tale more violent than the last. Coyote sat at the edge of the circle, watching the Viper hold court. In the firelight, the gang leader's scars seemed to dance across his face. The most prominent one, a jagged line running from his left eye to his jaw, had a story everyone knew, but none dared mention. It was a reminder of the only man who'd ever bested him in a fight, a legendary gunslinger who disappeared years ago after a massacre in Tombstone. Tomorrow, the Viper announced, cleaning his revolver with methodical precision, we remind these farmers why the Arizona territory ain't for the weak. We'll start with that prosperous farm Quickdraw mentioned, make an example of whoever's foolish enough to think they can thrive out here without our permission. As the gang settled in for the night, Coyote took first watch. In the distance, coyotes howled at the moon, their cries echoing off the canyon walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were laughing at what was to come. Little did the viper know, the farmer he'd chosen as his first target was no ordinary settler. The man they would encounter the next day had traded his famous guns for farming tools years ago, seeking peace in anonymity. But some skills never fade, and some men never truly escape their past. Dawn approached with the promise of violence, and as the Rattler gang prepared to ride, fate was already drawing its cards for a game none of them were truly prepared to play. The gang's most feared enforcer, Iron Hand Rodriguez, emerged from his tent, adjusting the mechanical contraption that replaced his right hand, a cruel device of brass and steel with interchangeable attachments. He'd lost the original hand in a dynamite accident years ago, but the replacement had made him even more deadly. "Found something interesting while scouting," he announced, unrolling a piece of paper. "That farmer you mentioned, he's got quite a reputation for fairness, been helping other settlers with their crops, sharing his water." The viper's eyes glinted. With malice, perfect. Nothing demoralizes a community more than watching their hero fall. Quickdraw laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Ain't that the truth? Remember Mesa Verde? That sheriff thought being popular would protect him." "Shut it," the viper snapped, shooting his brother a warning look. The Mesa Verde incident was still too recent to discuss openly, with Pozes potentially still on their trail. The gang's tracker, a silent Apache renegade known as Shadow, appeared at the edge of the camp. He moved like his namesake, seemingly materializing from the darkness. In his hands, he held fresh tracks cast in plaster. Many riders passed through here recently, heavy horses, military-trained. The viper studied the tracks, his expression darkening. "Cavalry?" Shadow shook his head. "Marshals, 4, maybe 5, 2 days old." This news sent a ripple of unease through the camp. U.S. Marshals were a different breed from local lawmen, more persistent, better trained, and usually former military. The viper paced, considering this new information. "Change of plans," he finally announced. "We split up. 3 groups. Iron Hand, take 4 men and create a distraction near the mining camp east of Salvation's Creek. Quickdraw, you and Shadow lead 3 more along the South Trail. Make noise, be seen, but don't engage. I want those marshals chasing shadows while we handle our farmer friend." Coyote watched the gang divide their forces, each group preparing for their role. He'd been assigned to the Viper's personal squad, an honor that felt more like a noose around his neck. As he saddled his horse, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh notches being carved into the Viper's gun grip. "Insurance," the Viper explained, catching his gaze. "Each notch is a promise. By sunset tomorrow, we'll have either a cooperative community or 13 new marks, starting with one particularly stubborn farmer." The morning sun began painting the sky in shades of blood and gold as the 3 groups prepared to depart. Coyote couldn't help but notice how the viper kept touching the scar on his face, a nervous tic he'd only display when something was truly bothering him. Perhaps he too felt it, the strange electricity in the air, the sense that they were riding toward something far more dangerous than a simple farmer. The gang split up at the crossroads, each group disappearing into the vast Arizona landscape, like scattered grains of sand. As Coyote followed the viper toward their target, desert birds circled overhead, their cries sounding less like scavengers, anticipating a feast, and more like nature itself, trying to shout a warning. The morning sun cast long shadows across Samuel Cooper's farm as he worked his fields, his movements deliberate and precise. At 55, his face was weathered like old leather, but his eyes remained sharp as hawk talons. 20 acres of thriving crops stood in defiance of the drought. testament to years of careful water management and farming techniques learned from local tribes. Samuel paused his work, noting how the morning birds had suddenly gone silent. His hand instinctively moved toward his lower back, where a worn leather tool belt hung. Only the most observant might notice it wasn't designed for carrying farming implements. "Pa!" His daughter Catherine's voice carried from the farmhouse. "Riders coming, 5 of them." Without looking up, Samuel called back, "Get inside, Cathy, mind the shutters." His voice was soft, but carried the weight of authority earned through years few knew about. Catherine, 18 and fierce as a mountain lion, knew better than to argue when her father used that tone. The Vipers group emerged from the morning haze, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that glinted like gold in the early light. Samuel continued his work, seemingly absorbed in checking his irrigation channels, though his peripheral vision tracked every movement of the approaching riders. "Mighty fine-looking farm you got here, old-timer," the Viper called out, his voice carrying false friendliness, especially in these hard times. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Samuel straightened slowly, leaning on his hoe like any aging farmer might. "The good Lord provides," he answered simply, his posture relaxed, but his feet positioned just so, weight balanced perfectly. Coyote, watching from his horse, felt an odd sensation creep up his spine. Something about the farmer's stance seemed familiar, like a half-remembered warning. The Viper dismounted, his spurs jingling ominously in the morning quiet. "Lord help those who help themselves," they say, and you've helped yourself to quite a bit of water while your neighbor's crops wither and die. "My water comes from an underground spring," Samuel replied. "Been showing anyone who asks how to dig their own wells. Knowledge is free." Quick Draw spat into one of the irrigation channels. "Ain't nothing free in this territory, old man. Way we see it, you're hoarding resources. That makes you a problem for the community." Samuel's eyes flickered briefly to the contaminated channel, the only sign of emotion he'd shown. "Might want to watch where you spit, son. Man's laborers deserve respect." The Viper circled slowly, like his namesake preparing to strike. "Respect is earned through strength out here. Speaking of which—" He gestured, and one of his men dismounted, carrying a torch. "We're here to demonstrate some strength of our own." The man approached a storage shed, filled with dried corn and hay. Samuel's voice cut through the air like a steel blade. "That's not yours to burn." Something in his tone made the man hesitate, but the Viper barked, "Do it!" The torch touched the dry material, and flames began to spread. Samuel hadn't moved, but somehow he seemed to occupy more space than before, as if his stillness was more threatening than any motion could be. "Now," the Viper continued, drawing closer, "let's discuss the new arrangement. You've got water. The community needs water. We ensure fair distribution for a reasonable fee." Inside the farmhouse, Catherine watched through a crack in the shutters, her hands tight on a Winchester rifle. She'd seen her father handle trouble before, but something felt different this time. The tension in the air was thicker than summer storm clouds. "I have a counter-proposal," Samuel said quietly. "You put out that fire, ride away, and we forget this happened." The Viper's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Counter rejected. Maybe we need to make our point clearer." He drew his silver-plated revolver, aiming not at Samuel, but at the farmhouse. "Wonder if that pretty daughter of yours would be more reasonable about sharing resources?" What happened next seemed to defy natural law. Samuel's movement was like lightning contained in human form. His hand swept back, the tool belt falling away to reveal a custom Colt Peacemaker. Before the Viper could track the motion, his silver revolver went spinning into the dust, a precise shot having struck its hammer. The gang stood frozen, minds struggling to process what their eyes had witnessed. The Viper stared at his stinging. A hand, then at the farmer who suddenly didn't look old at all. That was a warning, Samuel said, his voice carrying across the suddenly still morning air. I've got 5 rounds left, 5 riders. Simple arithmetic. Quickdraw's hand twitched toward his gun, but Samuel's eyes locked onto him. Son, I've killed better men than you before breakfast, on my worst day, when I was actually old. The Viper's face had gone pale, recognition finally dawning. You're supposed to be dead. They said a lot of things, Samuel. Cut him off. Most of them are wrong. Now my daughter's got that Winchester trained on you all from the house. She's not as good as I am. A small, dangerous smile touched his lips. But at this range, she doesn't need to be. Coyote's horse shuffled nervously, sensing the charged atmosphere. The young bandit's eyes darted between his leaders and the farmer, watching a deadly calculation play out. The Viper slowly raised his hands, his face a mask of barely contained rage. This isn't over, old man. Nobody humiliates the Rattler gang. It's over for today, Samuel replied. Fire's spreading. Might want to help put it out before it reaches your horses. As if to emphasize his point, one of the horses whinnied in panic as flames licked closer to the hitching post. The gang scrambled to control their mounts and contain the fire they'd started, their threatening demeanor shattered by urgent necessity. Samuel kept his colt trained on them as they worked, his aim never wavering. Once the fire was out, he nodded toward the road. Time for you to leave. Tell your friends what happened here. Tell them Samuel Cooper's farm is off limits. The gang mounted up, dignity in tatters. As they turned to ride away, the Viper looked back, his face twisted with hate. Cooper. I'll remember that name. No, Samuel corrected him. You'll remember this moment. Every time you think about coming back, you'll remember how it felt when you realized you weren't the most dangerous thing on the horizon. They rode off in a cloud of dust and wounded pride. Samuel waited until they were out of sight before holstering his colt. Catherine emerged from the house, rifle still ready. You could have killed them, Pa, she said quietly. Samuel nodded, retrieving his fallen tool belt. Could have. Maybe I should have. But killing's a hard habit to break, and I've worked too long at breaking it. Catherine helped him assess the fire damage as the sun climbed higher. They'll be back, she said, with more men. Yes, Samuel agreed, checking the scorched wood of the storage shed. And now we've got decisions to make. The quiet life may have just gotten a lot louder. As they worked to repair the damage, neither spoke of what worried them most, not the gang's inevitable return, but the fact that Samuel Cooper's true identity would soon spread through the territory like wildfire. Some secrets, once revealed, couldn't be buried again, and some pasts refused to stay in their graves. The morning birds gradually returned, their songs resuming as if nothing had happened. But something fundamental had shifted in the Arizona territory. By sundown, whispers would begin spreading through saloons and camps. Whispers about a farmer who moved like lightning and shot like death itself. The peace Samuel had built over years of quiet labor was unraveling, and the only question was how much blood would be spilled before new peace could be found. Samuel spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the farmhouse windows, his movements mechanical as his mind wandered to places he'd tried to forget. Catherine watched him work, recognizing the shadow that had crossed his face, the same one she'd seen on rare nights when he'd wake up shouting names of people long dead. You never told me everything about before, she said, helping him carry boards from the barn. About who you really were. Samuel paused, running a calloused hand along a piece of wood. Some stories are better left untold, Kathy, especially ones written in blood. I'm not a child anymore, Pa. If trouble's coming, I need to know what we're facing. He studied his daughter's face, seeing her mother's determination in her eyes. Your man used to look at me just like that when she wanted answers. He sighed, selecting his next words carefully. Before I was Samuel Cooper the farmer, I rode with the law, U.S. Marshal Service. Did things that needed doing when regular. Law wasn't enough. Is that all? Catherine pressed, sensing there was more. No. Samuel's voice grew distant. Before that, I was something else. Something harder. They called me the Ghost of Tombstone back then. Not because I was quiet or sneaky. He gripped the wooden board tighter, but because anyone who crossed my path ended up haunting the boot hill. Catherine absorbed this in silence, pieces of her childhood suddenly making new sense. The way her father would practice his shooting in secret before dawn, how he taught her to track and shoot with a precision that seemed beyond a simple "you farmers' needs." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a wagon. Samuel's hand moved to his Colt, but relaxed when he recognized Ezra Johnson, their nearest neighbor, driving his team hard toward the farm. "Samuel!" Ezra called out, reining in his horses. "Just rode in from town. You need to hear this." The older man's face was grave. "Marshals are there, asking questions about the Rattler gang, but that ain't the worst of it. Seems the Vipers got a personal army camped in the Diablos Mountains. 50 men at least, maybe more." Samuel helped Ezra down from the wagon. "How good are they?" "Bad enough. Word is they're all killers the Vipers recruited over the past year. Been planning something big." Ezra glanced nervously at the horizon. "Samuel, if even half of what they say about the Vipers' army is true—" "Numbers don't mean much," Samuel replied, though his eyes had grown hard. "Quality matters more than quantity in a fight." "That's just it," Ezra continued. "These ain't regular bandits. The Viper's been gathering men with military experience, Confederate deserters, Union soldiers gone bad, Mexican war veterans. He's building something more dangerous than a gang." Catherine watched her father's expression change subtly as he processed this information. It wasn't fear she saw. It was something closer to resignation, like a man who'd just heard a door close on his past life. "Ezra," Samuel said finally, spread the word. "Anyone who wants to learn how to defend themselves, I'll teach them, free of charge, and tell Sheriff Matthews I need to speak with him." As Ezra rode off, Catherine turned to her father. "You're going to fight them all?" Samuel shook his head. "No, little bird. I'm going to teach others to fight, because the Viper's about to learn the hardest lesson in the West. A man alone. Might be dangerous, but a community standing together." He smiled grimly. "That's deadlier than any ghost from Tombstone." Dawn hadn't yet broken when Catherine spotted the signal fire on Eagle's Ridge. 3 quick flashes, then darkness. Jacob. Matthew's warning system was working. The Rattler gang had been sighted moving through Shadow Canyon, their numbers far greater than before. "They're trying to flank the town," Samuel muttered, already saddling his paint horse. The past week had been spent preparing the community, teaching basic shooting techniques to farmers who'd barely held a gun before. Now they'd see if any of it mattered. Catherine emerged from the house wearing her mother's old riding clothes, a Winchester slung across her back. "I'm coming with you." "No." Samuel's voice was firm as steel. "You're leading the second part of the plan. Get everyone to the meeting point we discussed. If this goes wrong—" He checked his Colt's action, the familiar click-click like a heartbeat in the pre-dawn silence. "It won't," Catherine insisted, but mounted her horse anyway. She'd learned to read her father's tones over the years. This one left no room for argument. Samuel rode out alone, following the hidden trail they'd scouted days earlier. The morning mist clung to the ground like a burial shroud, perfect cover for what he had in mind. As he approached Shadow Canyon, he could hear the gang's horses, their riders trying to move quietly, but betrayed by loose stones and echoing hoofbeats. The Viper had brought 20 men for this raid, expecting to overwhelm any resistance through sheer numbers. What he couldn't know was that Samuel had spent decades learning these canyons, first as a marshal tracking outlaws, then as a farmer studying water sources. Every blind turn, every acoustic trick the stone walls could play, they were all And tools in his arsenal now, Samuel positioned himself on a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon's bottleneck. The gang's lead scouts passed below, oblivious to his presence. He waited until the Viper himself came into view, then fired a single shot that sparked off the canyon wall inches from the gang leader's head. The effect was instantaneous. The narrow canyon amplified the gunshot into a thunderous roar, spooking horses and sending riders scrambling for cover. Samuel was already moving, his horse sure-footed on paths too treacherous for most to attempt. "There! Up high!" Quickdraw's voice echoed through the canyon. "It's that damned farmer." Samuel fired twice more, each shot precisely placed to create maximum chaos without casualties. Horses reared, riders cursed, and the gang's formation broke apart like a dropped mirror. Just as planned. The Viper's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't let him split us up, stay together." But it was too late. Samuel's strategy wasn't to fight, it was to divide. 3 more shots, their echoes bouncing off the canyon walls, made it impossible to tell where they'd originated. The gang split into smaller groups, each pursuing what they thought was their target. Samuel guided his horse down a nearly invisible trail, leading 5 riders deeper into the maze of stone. Behind him, he could hear the Viper shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation. But the canyon's acoustics turned every command into confusing echoes. Quickdraw's group broke off to the east, following what they thought was the sound of hoofbeats. Iron Hand led another contingent west, tracking dust clouds that could have been their quarry. The Viper, alongside Coyote and 3 others, maintained the central pursuit. Samuel emerged from the canyon into open country, but there was no retreat. Every hoofbeat was purposeful, every turn calculated. He was leading the Viper's group exactly where he wanted them. "He's making for open ground," Coyote called out. "We can flank him there." The Viper knew better. "Since when does a fox run to an open country? He's playing us for fools." Samuel allowed himself a grim smile as he heard the exchange. The young bandit's eagerness would work in his favor. He led them through a series of switchbacks, always staying just within sight, but never quite in range for a clean shot. The chase led to what appeared to be a dead end, a box canyon with sheer walls. The Viper's group fanned out, believing they had their prey cornered. Samuel and his horse vanished into what seemed to be a shallow cave. "We got him now!" one of the riders crowed, spurring his horse forward. "Wait!" The Viper's warning came. Too late. The cave was actually a tunnel, part of an old mining operation Catherine had discovered during her explorations. Samuel emerged on the other side, just as a cascade of loose rocks, carefully prepared days ago, blocked the entrance. Behind him, he could hear cursing and the sound of horses being turned around, forced to find another way around the blockage. But Samuel wasn't done. This was just the first act of a carefully orchestrated plan. He rode hard for the next position where the real trap waited. Behind him, the Viper's group would be forced to take the long way around, directly into the killing ground Samuel had selected. Meanwhile, Quickdraw's group had followed false trails until they found themselves in a narrow arroyo. The first warning they had was the sound of cattle, hundreds of them, being driven toward their position by hidden riders. Catherine had done her part perfectly, using the Richardson family's entire herd to create a stampede that would cut off any retreat. Iron Hand's contingent fared no better. They emerged from their chosen path to find themselves facing a line of farmers armed with rifles, positioned behind overturned wagons. These weren't the scared settlers they'd expected. A week of Samuel's training had transformed them into a coordinated defense force. Back in the main canyon, Samuel reached his chosen position just as the Viper's group finally cleared the blocked tunnel. They emerged to find themselves in a natural amphitheater, steep walls on 3 sides, and Samuel Cooper waiting on the 4th. His colt, drawn, called out, his voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "Remind you of anywhere, Ma. Quieter." Ride, Samuercus. Maybe a certain day in Tombstone, the Viper's face contorted with rage. Ghost or not, you're just one man. We still outnumber you. Numbers? Samuel's laugh was cold as mountain water. Count again. On the ridges above, rifles. Appeared dozens of them. The town's citizens had positioned themselves exactly as Samuel had taught them, covering every angle of escape. The Viper's men found themselves in the center of a trap that had been days in the making. See, that's the difference between us, Samuel continued. You build armies, I build communities. Now you've got two choices. Surrender your guns and face the law, or what? The Viper snarled. Or find out if you can dodge bullets as well as you dodge responsibility for your actions. The tension stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. Coyote looked between his leader and the farmer, suddenly understanding why the old stories spoke of the ghost of Tombstone with such fear. It wasn't just his speed with a gun. It was his ability to turn the tables, to transform a simple chase into an intricate trap. The sound of more hoofbeats approaching from behind made the Viper turn. Catherine rode in, leading U.S. Marshals, who had been quietly positioned in town for just this moment. The trap wasn't just complete, it had been perfect from the start. Your men are already surrendering, Catherine announced. Both other groups, seems they're smarter than their leader. The Viper's hand twitched toward his gun, and for a moment it seemed he might choose a suicidal last stand. But Coyote made the decision for all of them, dropping his weapon first. The others followed suit, leaving only the Viper holding onto his deadly pride. Marcus, Samuel said quietly, using the Viper's real name, you've got good men mixed in with the bad. Don't add their deaths to your conscience. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the canyon. Then, with a curse that would have made the devil blush, the Viper threw down his silver-plated revolver, but the Viper wasn't finished. As Marshal Thompson moved to arrest him, he revealed his final, desperate gambit. You think you've won. My army in the Diablos Mountains is still out there. 50 trained killers who'll burn this territory to ash when they hear about this. Samuel remained unmoved. You mean the army camped at Broken Spoke Valley? A slight smile touched his lips. Might want to hold off on those threats. The Viper's face showed the first flicker of real fear. How did you... While you were chasing me, Samuel explained, the Apache scouts I hired were leading the territorial militia right to your camp. Man named Iron Hand was kind enough to draw us a map last night after we caught him trying to sneak into town. Catherine picked up the story. Turns out your fearsome enforcer has a weakness for poker, lost everything to Sally at the saloon, including his pride. Amazing what people will trade for a chance to win it all back. The revelation hit the Viper's remaining men hard, their impregnable mountain fortress, their backup plan, all undone by a card game and a farmer's careful planning. You see, Marcus, Samuel continued, dismounting to approach his old adversary, you never understood the real strength of these communities you prey on. It's not in their guns or their money. It's in their connections, their trust in each other. Marshal Thompson began shackling the prisoners, but Samuel raised his hand. Wait, there's one more thing. He turned to Coyote, who stood apart from the other captured men. Young man, step forward. Coyote approached cautiously, expecting punishment. Instead, Samuel spoke quietly, so only those nearest could hear. I watched you during the chase. You had 3 clear shots at me, but you aimed wide every time. The young bandit's eyes widened. You knew? A man who chooses not to shoot when he has the chance. That says something about his character. Samuel glanced at Marshal Thompson. If you're willing to testify against the Viper and help track down any gang members we missed, I'll speak to the judge about leniency. Coyote looked between Samuel and his former leader, years of fear and manipulation warring with a chance at redemption. Finally, he nodded. I'll tell you everything I know, The viper lunged at the young man, but was quickly restrained. "Traitor, you're dead! You hear me? When my men—" "Your men are already in custody," interrupted a new voice. Sheriff Matthews rode up, dust-covered but grinning. "Just got word. The territorial militia hit their camp an hour ago. Most surrendered without a fight. Seems an army of killers isn't so tough when their paychecks stop coming." As the prisoners were led away, Catherine approached her father. "You knew, didn't you, about Coyote? That's why you made sure he was in the Viper's group for the chase." Samuel nodded. "Saw something in his eyes that first day at the farm." "Same. Look I had when I was young and riding with the wrong crowd. Sometimes people just need a chance to choose a different path." The sun was high now. The morning's mists long burned away. Farmers began emerging from their positions on the ridges, many still shocked at what they'd accomplished. Samuel watched them with pride, seeing not just survivors, but a community that had found its strength. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, helping to collect the discarded weapons. Samuel surveyed the scene, the captured gang members, the triumphant townspeople, the vast territory that had seen so much violence. Now we get back to farming, but first—" He turned to Sheriff Matthews with a grin. "I believe Sally at the saloon owes us all a drink. Seems only fair since her poker skills helped save the territory." As they rode back to town, the canyon walls echoed with different sounds than they had that morning. Laughter, victory cheers, and the simple joy of people who had stood together against tyranny. The ghost of Tombstone had emerged from retirement, not to haunt the wicked, but to show good people how to banish their own ghosts. Yet even in victory, Samuel kept his eyes on the horizon. Experience had taught him that in the West, peace was as changeable as the wind, and somewhere out there, new threats were always brewing. But for now, his community had learned to defend itself, and that was worth more than all the gold in Arizona. 3 days after the Viper's capture, an unseasonable storm descended on Salvation's Creek. Lightning split the sky as Samuel Cooper sat in Sheriff Matthews' office studying a telegram that had just arrived from Yuma prison. The news it carried was worse than any weather. Breakout. Samuel's voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened on the paper. "How many?" Sheriff Matthews poured 2 fingers of whiskey into tin cups. 15 prisoners, including some faces you might remember: Johnny the Butcher McGraw, Caleb Stone, and the Hawkins twins. He pushed 1 cup toward Samuel. "All of them were part of the Viper's old crew from his Tombstone days." "Not a coincidence." Samuel left the whiskey untouched. "Someone planned this. The timing's too perfect." A flash of lightning illuminated the office, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, Samuel watched. Townsfolk hurrying to secure livestock and equipment against the storm. These people had just started to feel safe again. "There's more," Matthews added grimly. 2 guards were killed in the breakout. One of them was Tom Riley. The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Young Tom had served under him during his martial days, barely more than a boy when Samuel had trained him in the art of guarding desperate men. Now he was dead, leaving behind a wife and infant son in Prescott. "Margaret needs to know her husband died bravely," Samuel said quietly. "I'll ride to Prescott myself." "In this weather, that's a 3-day ride through Apache territory, assuming." "The passes aren't flooded." Matthews shook his head. "Let me send a deputy." "No." Samuel stood, his decision made. "I owe Tom this. Besides," he finally took the whiskey, downing it in one swift motion. "Someone needs to warn the other settlements. These aren't just escaped prisoners. They're men with a grudge and nothing left to lose." Back at the farm, Catherine took the news of his impending departure with the same quiet strength her mother had shown years ago. She helped him pack provisions, checking his ammunition and adding extra medical supplies without being asked. "The Hawkins twins," she said as she worked. "They're The ones who burned down the orphanage in Tucson. Yes. Samuel checked his saddle straps. But that's not the worst of it. Johnny McGraw, he was the Viper's mentor, taught him everything about building criminal empires. If he's involved, then this was planned long before we captured the Viper, Catherine finished. It was their backup strategy all along. Thunder rolled across the valley as Samuel mounted up. Catherine handed him his oilskin coat, her face betraying worry she'd never voice aloud. Promise me you'll be careful, Pa. These men, they're not like the Viper. They don't care about reputation or pride. They just want to hurt people. I know, little bird. He squeezed her hand. Keep the town safe while I'm gone. Sheriff Matthews will need help organizing patrols. As Samuel rode out into the storm, the wind carried memories he'd tried to bury. Johnny the Butcher McGraw had earned his nickname not through violence, though he was plenty violent, but through his methodical approach to crime. He carved up territories like cuts of meat, bleeding them dry through a combination of terror and calculated business practices. The rain grew heavier as Samuel followed the old trail toward Prescott. Visibility dropped to mere feet, but his horse knew the way. They'd made this journey countless times during his martial days, though never in such conditions. Near midnight, at a crossing of the Verde River, Samuel spotted the first sign of trouble. Fresh hoofprints in the mud, at least 8 horses heading east. The tracks were deep, the horses were carrying heavy loads or riders. He dismounted to examine them more closely, using his oilskin to shield a match from the rain. Among the prints, he found a distinctive pattern, a horseshoe with a star forge welded to the heel. Only one blacksmith in the territory made shoes like that, and he'd done work for the Hawkins twins before they were captured. Samuel was about to remount when a bullet whizzed past his ear, the sound nearly lost in the storm. He dove behind a boulder as more shots followed, counting the muzzle flashes through the rain. 3 shooters spread out along the ridgeline. "That's far enough, Ghost," a familiar voice called out. Caleb Stone, his accent as thick as Samuel remembered. "Figured you'd come this way." "Stone," Samuel called back. "Tom Riley was a good man. He didn't deserve to die like that. Ain't nothing personal." Another voice, one of the Hawkins twins. "But we got plans, and you got a habit of spoiling them." Samuel assessed his situation. The ridge offered his attackers high ground, but the storm worked in his favor. Lightning flashes would ruin their night vision, and the rain would make precise shooting difficult. He had 7 rounds in his Colt and 12 in the Winchester, against at least 3 opponents who knew exactly where he was. A plan formed in his mind, dangerous but necessary. Samuel removed his oilskin coat and hat, placing them carefully on a branch to create a silhouette. Then he began crawling through the mud, using thunder to mask his movements. "Last chance, Cooper," Stone called out. "Ride back to your farm. Pretend you never saw us." Samuel's response was a carefully aimed shot that sent Stone's hat flying. The Outlaws returned fire, shredding Samuel's coat on the branch while he circled behind them. The first outlaw fell to a blow from Samuel's rifle butt, never seeing the attack coming. The second, Joel Hawkins, managed to turn, but Samuel was faster. They grappled in the mud until a lightning flash revealed the knife in Hawkins' hand. Samuel deflected the blade and landed a crushing strike to the outlaw's temple. Stone, realizing he was alone, attempted to flee. Samuel's warning shot stopped him cold. "Don't make me do it, Caleb." "You won't shoot an unarmed man?" Stone said, turning slowly with his hands raised. "Not the great ghost of Tombstone. You got too many rules." "Rules change," Samuel's voice carried over the storm, "especially when good men die leaving infant sons fatherless." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Stone's hand dropped to his boot, coming up with a derringer. Samuel's Colt roared once, and Stone fell, a look of genuine surprise on his face as the hidden gun slipped from lifeless fingers. The storm began to ease as Samuel tied up the unconscious outlaws and retrieved the bodies. He found papers on Stone's corpse, detailed plans for attacks on settlements throughout the territory. The breakout was just the beginning. McGraw and the others were planning a campaign of terror designed to destroy the very concept of law and order in the Arizona territory. Dawn was breaking as Samuel rode into the nearest army post with his prisoners and evidence. The commander took one look at the documents and immediately began mobilizing troops. Within hours, riders were dispatched to every settlement in the region. But as Samuel watched the military precision of the response, a cold certainty settled in his gut. This was what McGraw wanted, to spread the territory's defenders thin, create chaos and confusion. The real target had to be something else, something personal. The answer hit him like a physical blow. The papers, the planned raids, even the breakout itself, they were all elaborate distractions. McGraw knew Samuel would ride out to warn people, knew he'd follow the obvious threat, which meant Catherine and the town were the real targets all along. Samuel mounted his horse, already, knowing he'd be too late. He'd chosen to pursue justice for Tom Riley, to protect the wider territory. Now that choice would cost him everything he held dear, unless he could somehow defy time and distance to reach home before McGraw's real plan unfolded. The rising sun painted the storm clouds blood red as Samuel Cooper began the longest ride of his life, praying his sacrifice of duty over family wouldn't prove to be his final fatal mistake. His mind raced through possibilities as his horse thundered across the rain-soaked terrain. McGraw was a strategist, a man who thought 3 moves ahead. The prison break, the obvious trail east, Stone's attack, they weren't just distractions. They were pieces of a larger puzzle. Samuel's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. He reined in hard, directing his horse into a grove of cottonwoods. Through the branches, he spotted a patrol of U.S. Army cavalry, led by a familiar face, Captain James Morrison, a man he'd worked with during his marshal days. "Cooper!" Morrison called out, recognizing him. "Thank God! We've got reports of armed men moving south from the Mogollon Rim. They have hit 3 homesteads already." Samuel's blood ran cold. "South? The tracks I found were heading east." "Multiple groups," Morrison confirmed. "Coordinated attacks, hitting small farms and outlying ranches. But here's the strange part. They're not stealing anything, just destroying property and moving on." The pattern suddenly became clear. "They're forcing people to abandon their homes," Samuel said, "driving them into the larger settlements for protection, concentrating the targets." Morrison nodded grimly. "Already happening. Salvation's Creek's population has doubled since yesterday. Every farm family for 20 miles is seeking shelter there. That's what McGraw wants." Samuel spurred his horse forward. "Captain, get your men to Twin Buttes Pass. Cut off their escape route north. And send runners to Fort Apache. Tell them to watch their ammunition stores." "Ammunition?" Morrison's confusion was evident. "Cooper, what aren't you telling me?" "McGraw's not trying to destroy the settlements," Samuel explained, pieces falling into place. "He's gathering scared people together, creating perfect targets, but he needs weapons, lots of them. There's only one place in the territory with enough firearms and ammunition to arm his entire crew." "Fort Apache," Morrison breathed. "But that's impossible. No one could take a military fort. They don't need to take it." Samuel's voice was grim. "Just create enough chaos to raid the armory. Once they're armed—" He left the implications unspoken. As the cavalry rode north, Samuel continued his desperate journey home. The rain had made the trails treacherous, but he pushed his horse to its limits. Every minute counted now. Near sundown, he encountered more evidence of McGraw's strategy. The Watson family's farm, normally a bustling homestead, stood abandoned. But something wasn't right. Samuel dismounted, checking the ground around the house. The signs were subtle. Boot prints that didn't match the family's. Cigar ash too fresh to be from before the evacuation. This hadn't been a random raid. Someone had watched the house, waiting to confirm it was empty. Inside, Samuel found more clues. The furniture had been moved slightly, creating clear lines of sight to the main road. Gun oil stains marked the windowsills. This wasn't just an abandoned farm, it was a forward observation post. In the barn, he discovered a dead horse hidden under hay. High-quality animal, Mexican breeding, the kind favored by the Hawkins twins for their fast raids. But this horse hadn't died in combat. It had been intentionally put down to hide the raiders' presence. Samuel's military training screamed warnings at him. McGraw wasn't just coordinating attacks, he was establishing a network of hidden positions. Around Salvation's Creek, each abandoned homestead could now be an enemy stronghold, allowing his men to monitor movements and control access to the town. A glint of metal caught his eye as he searched the barn. Behind a loose board, he found a cache of supplies, ammunition, dried beef, even medical supplies. This wasn't a temporary position. McGraw was preparing for a sustained operation. Samuel took what he could carry and destroyed the rest. As he prepared to ride out, movement on the road caught his attention. A group of refugees was approaching, led by young Billy Watson himself. The family hadn't abandoned their home. They'd been delayed returning from a supply run. "Mr. Cooper," Billy called out, relief evident in his voice. "Pa sent us to get more ammunition from town. Raiders hit Henderson Place last night." Samuel quickly mounted up. "Billy, get your family to Salvation's Creek, but don't use the main road. Take the creek bed trail. Tell everyone you meet. McGraw's men are watching the roads." McGraw? The boy's face went pale. The name was legend even, to children. "But he's in prison." "Not anymore." Samuel tossed him a spare canteen. "And Billy, when you get to town, find my daughter. Tell her Tucson Gambit. She'll understand." The Tucson Gambit, a strategy they'd developed years ago for just such an emergency. Catherine would know to begin evacuating the most vulnerable residents through the old mining tunnels, creating an escape route if the town was attacked. As Samuel rode on, the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape. Each abandoned farm he passed could now be an enemy position. Every patch of high ground might hide McGraw's observers. The territory he knew so well had become a maze of potential threats. Yet something still bothered him about the pattern. McGraw was being too obvious, leaving too many clues. The man Samuel remembered was more subtle, more patient, unless a horrible thought struck him. What if this elaborate network of positions wasn't meant to control the town at all? What if their real purpose was to keep people like him, people who could recognize the signs, focused on the strategic threat, while something even worse approached from an unexpected direction? Samuel changed course, taking a deer trail that led to higher ground. He needed to see the bigger picture to understand what McGraw's master plan really was. As his horse picked its way up the steep slope, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was still playing into his enemy's hands, still reacting instead of understanding. The fate of the entire territory might depend on whether he could solve this puzzle in time. But with every passing moment, the sun sank lower, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, Johnny the Butcher McGraw was ready to begin his real plan, whatever it might be. Night had fully descended when Samuel reached the overlook above. Salvation's Creek, the town below, was illuminated by more lanterns than usual, its streets crowded with refugees from outlying farms. But something about the scene struck him as wrong. The patterns of movement, the positioning of guards, even the way the dogs were behaving. Through his spyglass, he spotted Catherine organizing the townspeople, directing them with the quiet efficiency she'd inherited from her mother. She had understood his message. The most vulnerable residents were being quietly moved through the old mining tunnels, though the activity was masked by the general chaos of the refugee influx. A flicker of movement on a distant rooftop caught his attention. Someone was using heliograph signals, quick flashes of light barely noticeable among the general illumination. Samuel quickly decoded the message. "Target confirmed. A wait signal. His blood ran cold. The observation posts weren't just watching, they were coordinating, but with whom? The answer came with a sound that didn't belong. The distant whistle of a locomotive. Salvation's Creek had no railway. The nearest line was 20 miles away through Apache Pass. Yet the sound was unmistakable, growing louder. Samuel spurred his horse down the trail, pushing harder than was safe in the darkness. He had finally understood McGraw's true plan, and it was more ambitious than anything he'd imagined. The train robbery near Socorro 6 months ago, it hadn't been about money. The Outlaws had stolen something far more dangerous, a massive steam-powered drilling machine bound for the silver mines. At the time, its theft had seemed pointless. Now Samuel understood. The old silver mine beneath Salvation's Creek had been abandoned due to flooding from underground springs. But with a powerful enough drill, Samuel reached the town's edge just as the ground began to tremble. The vibrations came not from above, but from below. The drilling machine was already at work, boring through the rock beneath their feet. "Catherine!" he shouted, finding his daughter organizing evacuees. "They're not attacking the town, they're attacking the foundation." Understanding dawned in her eyes. The underground springs, the honeycomb of mining tunnels, the weight of buildings and people above. McGraw wasn't planning to shoot up the town. He was going to collapse it into the earth itself. "Get everyone out," Samuel ordered. But it was already beginning. The first sinkhole opened in the middle of Main Street, swallowing a wagon hole. Cracks spread like lightning through the packed earth, buildings groaning as their foundations shifted. Sheriff Matthews appeared, firing his revolver in the air to get people's attention. "Everyone to high ground, now!" But McGraw had planned for this too. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, not aimed to kill, but to drive the panicking crowds back toward the unstable ground. The hidden observers in the abandoned farms had been joined by more of McGraw's men, creating a ring of fire around the town. Samuel's mind raced. The drilling machine had to be in the main tunnel, where the original silver vein had been discovered. If they could reach it, "Catherine, get these people to the north slope," he instructed. "The rock's more stable there." He turned to Matthews. "Jim, I need every stick of dynamite in town." "The mining cache in Peterson's store," Matthews nodded, "but the street's already starting to go." "Then we better move fast." They fought their way through the chaos to Peterson's general store. The building was listing dangerously, its foundation cracking. Inside, they found Pete Peterson himself, stubbornly gathering supplies. "Been waiting for you," the old miner said, revealing a cache of explosives. "Figured if anyone could make use of these, it'd be you." Another tremor shook the building. Through the windows, they could see more sinkholes opening, buildings slowly tilting as the ground beneath them turned treacherous. The drilling machines' whistle sounded closer now, accompanied by the groan of overtaxed support beams. "We need to split up," Samuel decided. "Sheriff, take the west tunnel entrance. Pete, you know the east shaft better than anyone. I'll take the main entrance. First one to reach that machine stops it, whatever it takes." Matthews checked his ammunition. "What about McGraw's men?" "They'll be following us down," Samuel replied. Grimly, "Mining tunnels make for close quarters, might work in our favor." They separated, each carrying a share of the dynamite. Samuel moved through the town, helping people clear buildings when he could. The devastation was spreading faster now. McGraw's machine was weakening key support points with deadly precision. At the main tunnel entrance, Samuel found signs of recent activity, fresh boot prints in the mud, tool marks on the new support beams. McGraw's men had been preparing this for days, maybe weeks. He lit a lantern and descended into darkness. The tunnel air was heavy with mineral scents and the ozone tang of disturbed rock. Water trickled down the walls. The underground springs were already responding to the disruption. The drilling machine's noise grew louder as Samuel worked his way deeper. He passed old mining equipment, abandoned tools, and finally bodies. 3 of them, McGraw's men, were killed by a tunnel collapse they hadn't anticipated. The ground was growing more unstable by the minute. A shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. Samuel dove behind an ore cart as more bullets sparked off the rock walls. Through the gaps, he caught glimpses of movement. At least 4 men guarding the approach to the drilling machine. That's far enough, Ghost. The voice belonged to Luke Hawkins, the surviving twin. McGraw said you'd figure it out, but it's too late. The support structure already compromised. Samuel reached into his coat, removing one of the dynamite sticks. Tell McGraw I'm coming for him next. McGraw ain't here, Hawkins laughed. He's got bigger plans. This is just the beginning. The implications hit Samuel hard. Salvation's Creek wasn't the real target. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept. If McGraw had more drilling machines, no town in the territory would be safe. Another tremor shook the tunnel. Rocks fell from the ceiling as support beams cracked. They were running out of time. Samuel lit the dynamite's fuse with his lantern. The guards tensed, expecting him to throw it at them. Instead, he wedged it into a fissure in the tunnel wall and took cover. The explosion was devastating in the confined space. Through the dust and chaos, Samuel charged forward. He caught the first guard with a shoulder tackle, disarming him in close quarters. The second went down to a precise shot. Hawkins and the last guard retreated toward the drilling machine, its massive form now visible through the settling dust. The machine was a monster of steel and steam, its drill bit chewing through solid rock with terrifying efficiency. But Samuel noticed something else. The water trickling down the walls had increased to a steady flow. The underground springs were finding new paths through the fractured rock. "You're too late!" Hawkins shouted over the machine's roar. "Even if you stop us, the damage is done. The whole town's going down." Samuel's response was to shoot the machine's pressure gauge. Steam erupted from the breach, filling the tunnel with scalding vapor. Through the chaos, he heard more shooting. Matthews and Peterson had reached the other tunnels, engaging McGraw's men from multiple directions. The floor beneath them buckled as the compromised rock structure began to fail. Water was pouring in now, turning the tunnel floor into a treacherous mix of mud and debris. "Last chance, Hawkins," Samuel called out. "Surrender or drown." But Hawkins had inherited his brother's stubborn streak. He charged through the steam, firing wildly. Samuel met him head-on, their fight becoming a desperate struggle in the flooding tunnel. A final tremor shook the mountain. The drilling machines' supports failed, and the massive device began to tip. Hawkins, seeing his death approaching in tons of falling steel, finally broke. He turned to run, only to be caught by the collapse. Samuel barely escaped the tunnel as it caved in behind him. The drilling machine's destruction had ironically helped stabilize the remaining tunnels, its bulk helping to support what was left of the underground structure. He emerged into the early morning light to find the town forever changed. Several buildings had been lost to sinkholes, others would need to be torn down, but the majority of structures still stood. And more importantly, the evacuation had succeeded. No lives had been lost. Catherine ran to embrace him, covered in dust but alive. "Pete and the sheriff?" "Right here," Matthews called out, helping. Peterson, limp from the east tunnel. "Got most of McGraw's men. Few might have escaped through the old ventilation shafts." Samuel nodded grimly. This was just the beginning. McGraw's planning something bigger. "Then we'll stop him," Catherine said firmly. "Together." As the sun rose over the damaged town, Samuel couldn't shake Hawkins' final words. McGraw had bigger plans, and now he had a tested strategy for destroying any settlement he chose. The war for the Arizona Territory was just beginning, and its first battle had been fought not with guns and courage, but with machines and treachery. The town's doctor, Edwin Walsh, approached Samuel with a grave expression. "Found something you need to see?" He led Samuel to his office, where one of McGraw's captured men lay wounded. "He's been asking for you. Says he has information about McGraw's next target." The wounded man was young, barely 20. His injuries were severe, caught in one of the tunnel collapses. "Cooper," he wheezed, "McGraw. He ain't just hitting towns. He's got a map, railway stations, telegraph offices, gonna cut the territory in half." Samuel leaned closer. "What do you mean, cut it in half?" "3 more machines," the young man coughed. "Bigger than this one, gonna hit the supply lines, military posts, Indian reservations." His breathing became labored. Said, "Once people can't get help, can't communicate, they'll turn on each other. Terror does the work for him." The man's eyes closed, his breathing shallow but stable. Dr. Walsh pulled Samuel aside. "He'll alive, but he said all he can for now." Outside, Catherine was organizing recovery efforts. Teams of townspeople were assessing building damage, marking structures too dangerous to enter. The community's spirit remained unbroken, but Samuel could see fear in their eyes, fear of what might come next. "Pa!" Catherine called out, pointing to an approaching rider. It was Billy Watson, returning from his scouting mission. The boy's face was ashen. "Mr. Cooper," Billy reported, dismounting, "found something at Devil's Gap. McGraw's men, they've got a camp hidden in the old copper mine, but that ain't the worst part." He handed over a crumpled paper, engineering diagrams for something massive. "They're building some kind of platform on rails. Overheard them talking about moving it between attacks." Samuel studied the diagrams. "Mobile drilling platform. They're adapting, making the machine transportable by rail." He looked at the surrounding faces. This was a test run. The real attack will be much worse. Sheriff Matthews joined them, his usually cheerful face grim. "Got word from the Army Patrol. They found 2 more bodies out by Twin Buttes, telegraph operators. Lines have been cut for 20 miles in every direction." "He's isolating us," Samuel realized, "creating dead zones where no one can call for help. The drilling machines are just part of it. He's building a trap, piece by piece." Catherine's expression hardened. "Then we warn everyone. Ride to every settlement in the territory if we have to." "No," Samuel said slowly, a plan forming. "That's what he expects. We'd spread ourselves thin, trying to protect everything at once." He turned to Matthews. "Jim, remember the Prescott bank robbery? How did we caught them?" The sheriff's eyes lit up. "The fake gold shipment led them right into a trap." "Exactly. McGraw thinks he's the only one who can play a long game." Samuel spread out a map on a nearby wagon bed. "We don't stop his plan. We let him think it's working. But we choose the battlefield." He pointed to a location on the map. "Providence Station. It's perfect. Isolated, strategic railway junction, but built on solid bedrock. His drilling machines would take days to make a dent." "And the town?" Catherine asked. "Mostly abandoned after the silver ran out," Matthews added. "Few families left, easy to evacuate quietly." Samuel nodded. "We make it look valuable. Spread rumors about a military supply depot, secret government payroll storage, something too tempting for McGraw to resist." "Meanwhile," Catherine caught on, "we fortify it our way. Underground chambers rigged to flood. False buildings hiding. Artillery positions. A trap within a trap," Samuel confirmed. "But we'll need help, Jim. Contact every lawman you trust. Pete, we need miners. Men who know explosives and tunnel work. Billy, your family knows every trail in 3 counties. We'll need guides." The group dispersed, each with their tasks. Samuel caught Catherine's arm as she turned to go. "There's one more thing. Your mother's letters, the ones about her family ranch in Colorado." Catherine's eyes widened. "The mountain passes?" "McGraw's not the only one who can cut territory in half. If his men try to retreat north, they'll find every pass blocked," Catherine finished. "I'll write to Uncle James tonight." As the planning continued, Samuel watched his daughter coordinate with the townspeople. She had her mother's gift for Organization, but something more, an understanding of strategy that went beyond mere tactics. In her, he saw the future of law enforcement in the territory. Not just gunfighters and posses, but strategic thinkers who could anticipate and counter evolving threats. The town's carpenter approached with designs for false buildings, structures that looked solid but could be quickly collapsed to reveal defensive positions. The blacksmith had ideas for booby-trapping the railway switches. Even the schoolteacher offered her services, having previously worked as a telegraph operator. Samuel couldn't help but smile grimly. McGraw thought he was changing the rules of engagement with his machines and terror tactics, but he'd forgotten the most important rule of the West. Communities survived by adapting, by turning every hardship into a lesson and every setback into an advantage. As night fell over the damaged town, repairs were already underway. Lanterns lit the streets as people worked together, strengthening foundations and shoring up walls. But more importantly, they were strengthening bonds between neighbors, between towns, between lawmen and civilians. McGraw had wanted to show that no town was safe, that technology and terror could destroy any community. Instead, he'd given them the weapon they needed to defeat him, the knowledge that survival meant working together, thinking differently, and turning an enemy's strength into a weakness. Tomorrow they would begin laying their trap. But tonight, Samuel watched his town recover and knew that McGraw had already lost something precious, the element of surprise. The next phase of this war would be fought on their terms, not his. In his office, Samuel opened a dusty chest he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay his old marshal's badge and a matched pair of custom Colts, weapons from a past he'd tried to leave behind. But some battles required every tool, every skill, every hard-learned lesson of a violent life. "Time to remind them," he murmured, checking the perfectly maintained actions, "why they called me Ghost." Providence Station emerged from the morning mist like a ghost town, its weathered buildings standing sentinel along the railway tracks. 2 weeks of careful preparation had transformed the abandoned silver mining settlement into an elaborate trap, though few would notice the changes at first glance. Samuel Cooper stood on the station platform, watching as the last civilian families loaded their belongings onto wagons. His keen eyes noted every detail. The carefully concealed artillery positions in the old grain storage, the reinforced walls of the bank that now housed their ammunition cache, the innocent-looking water tower that could flood the underground. Tunnels on command. "Last group's heading out," Catherine reported, her voice low. "Marshal Kane's men are escorting them to Fort Apache." She handed her father a telegram. "And this just came from Uncle James. The Colorado passes are secured." Samuel read the message quickly, then burned it. Good. No escape route north when things go bad. He studied his daughter's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes. "You should go with them, Kathy. What's coming?" "It won't be like before. My place is here," she replied firmly. "Someone needs to coordinate the telegraph operators." They'd established a network of hidden stations in the hills, ready to coordinate their forces once McGraw took the bait. Inside the station house, Sheriff E.D. Matthews was briefing a select group of lawmen and volunteers. These weren't regular deputies or townspeople. They were veterans, scouts, and experienced Indian fighters, each chosen for specific skills. 7 access points to the underground system, Matthews explained, pointing to a detailed map. Each, one rigged to collapse on command. Once they move their drilling machines into position, we can trap them below ground. Among the gathered men, Samuel recognized faces from his marshal days. Marcus Red Cloud, an Apache scout who could read trail signs like others read books. Thomas Chen, a former railroad explosives expert who'd helped build the transcontinental line. Sarah Hawkins, no relation to the twins, whose skill with a long rifle had made her legendary among buffalo hunters. McGraw's smart, Samuel addressed the group. He'll send scouts first. They need to see exactly what he expects. A critical railway junction being used as a secret military supply depot. The fake cargo arrivals are scheduled for the next 3 days. Every crate and barrel's been carefully prepared to tell the story we want told. Sarah Hawkins examined her custom Sharps rifle. What about his observers in the hills? Man like McGraw won't move without eyes on the target. Already taken care of, Catherine interjected. Local Apache tribes owed Pa some favors. They're running a hunting party through McGraw's likely observation posts. Nothing obvious, just enough activity to force his men to keep their distance. Samuel nodded approvingly. Every detail mattered. McGraw had spent months planning his campaign of terror, but they'd learned from the attack on Salvation's Creek. This time, they were ready. A distant whistle caught their attention. The morning. Supply train approaching on schedule. This was their first test. If McGraw's men were watching, they needed to see a routine delivery of military supplies, not the carefully orchestrated performance it really was. Places, Matthews ordered quietly. Remember, we're just a small garrison protecting a supply. Depot. Nothing more. The group dispersed, each person falling into their assigned role. Samuel took up position in the station master's office, appearing to review manifests while actually scanning the surrounding hills through a disguised spyglass. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and coal smoke. Uniformed men, actually miners and ranchers in borrowed army surplus, began unloading crates marked Ordnance and U.S. Army supplies. Each box was carefully weighted to suggest ammunition or weapons, though they contained only sand and rocks. Movement in the scrubland caught Samuel's eye, a flash of reflected light from a distant ridge. "There you are," he murmured. McGraw's observers, right where they'd predicted. Through his spyglass, he could make out at least 3 men taking notes on the delivery. Catherine appeared beside him, passing a cup of coffee that provided cover for their conversation. "Spotted 4 more on the North Ridge," she whispered. "They're being careful, but not careful enough." "Good," Samuel replied. "Let them think they've outsmarted us. Everything depends on McGraw believing he has the upper hand." The day progressed with deliberate routine. Guards patrolled in predictable patterns, shift changes occurred on schedule, and supply wagons arrived and departed at regular intervals. To any observer, Providence Station appeared to be exactly what the rumors suggested, a crucial military supply point with minimal security. As evening approached, Samuel met with his core team in the station's hidden command center, constructed beneath the old ticket office. The walls were covered with maps and diagrams, each showing different aspects of their trap. "Latest report from our scouts," Marcus Redcloud announced. "McGraw's main forces gathered at 3 Crosses Ranch, 30 miles north, at least 60. Men heavily armed. The drilling machines are being assembled on rail platforms, just as we anticipated." Thomas Chen spread out technical drawings. "The platforms are clever work. They've modified flat cars with hydraulic stabilizers. Once in position, they can deploy the drills within minutes, which is why timing is crucial," Samuel reminded them. "We let them get the machines in place, let them think their plan is working. Only when they're fully committed do we spring the trap." Sarah Hawkins cleaned her rifle as she listened. "What about the butcher himself? McGraw won't risk being here for the initial attack." "No," Samuel agreed. "He'll watch from a distance, waiting for confirmation that the depot is vulnerable. That's when he'll make his appearance to claim the supposed weapons cache personally." A distant dinner bell rang, signaling the end of another carefully and choreographed day. As the sun set, Providence Station settled into its night routine, though few would sleep deeply. Every person here knew that each passing hour brought them closer to the coming battle. In his private quarters, Samuel removed his gun belt, studying the worn leather and well-maintained Colts. The weapons were a reminder of the life he'd tried. to leave behind, but also of the skills that might mean the difference between victory and disaster. Catherine found him there, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts, Pa." "Thinking about your mother," he admitted. "She always said I had a guardian angel watching over me. Said that's why they called me Ghost, because I had one foot in this world and one in the next." Maybe she was. "Right," Catherine suggested. "We survived Salvation's Creek. We survived because we were lucky," Samuel corrected. "McGraw's plan caught us by surprise. This time—" He checked his ammunition one more time. "This time we're not just surviving. We're ending this." The night deepened, stars emerging in the clear desert sky. In the distance, coyotes howled. Or perhaps it was Marcus Red Cloud's scouts, signaling that McGraw's observers were still in position. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but Samuel Cooper couldn't shake a nagging feeling. McGraw was too smart, too experienced to fall for a simple trap. The butcher had earned his nickname through cunning as much as cruelty. What if the observers they'd spotted were merely a distraction? What if McGraw had already seen through their deception? As if reading his thoughts, Catherine spoke softly. "We've planned for everything, Pa. Every angle, every possibility." "No plan survives contact with the enemy," Samuel quoted. "Your mother. You taught me that, oddly enough. Said it applied to baking as much as fighting." The memory brought a smile to both their faces, but it was short-lived. Tomorrow would bring another performance, another step in their elaborate deception. And somewhere out there, Johnny the Butcher McGraw was watching, planning, perhaps even now seeing through their carefully constructed facade. Samuel moved to the window, studying the moonlit landscape. The desert held many secrets, but none more dangerous than the ones in men's hearts. Tomorrow would bring them one day closer to their confrontation with McGraw, one day closer to either victory or disaster. The ghost of Tombstone had one more battle to fight, and this time the stakes were higher than ever before. The fate of the entire territory hung in the balance, and Samuel Cooper couldn't shake the feeling that they were all dancing to McGraw's tune, even as they thought they were leading him into a trap. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas Chen entered, carrying a set of technical drawings. "Found something in the old mining records," he said, spreading the papers on the desk. "There's a natural fault line running beneath the station. The original miners avoided it, but McGraw's. Men won't know to look for it," Samuel finished studying the diagrams. "If they drill there—" "The whole operation could collapse before we're ready," Chen confirmed. "We need to adjust our defensive positions." Sarah Hawkins joined them, her experienced hunter's eyes scanning the drawings. "The fault changes everything. We can't risk them hitting it by accident." She pointed to several positions on the map. "We need to channel them away from this area. Make other targets look more tempting." Marcus Red Cloud materialized from the shadows where he'd been standing unnoticed. "My scouts report movement at Three Crosses Ranch. McGraw's men are running drilling tests. The noise carries far in the night air." Samuel considered this news. "How many machines?" "4, Marcus replied. "Bigger than the one they used at Salvation's Creek. Steam-powered drilling heads mounted on rail cars, just as our young friend reported." Catherine pulled out her notebook, where she'd been tracking enemy movements. "They're sticking to the pattern. Testing equipment at night, moving supplies during storms when visibility is poor." She showed them a series of coded entries. "But something's odd. The supply wagons, they're carrying more than just machine parts." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "According to our observers, they're bringing in mining equipment, lots of it. Support beams, rail tracks, even ventilation equipment." She looked up at her father. "They're not just planning to collapse the station, they're planning to mine something." The implications hit them all at once. Samuel turned to Matthews, who had just entered the room. "Jim, what was Providence Station's main export before the silver ran out?" "Silver mainly, but—" The sheriff's eyes widened. There were rumors. Just before the mine closed, they found traces of gold, deep veins that were too expensive to reach with the technology they had then. "That's it," Samuel said softly. "McGraw doesn't just want to destroy the station. He wants to steal it, use the chaos of the collapse to cover his real goal, taking control of an abandoned gold mine." Sarah cleaned her rifle as she thought. Aloud. "Makes sense. Man like McGraw, he's always thinking about the long game. Why just destroy a town when you can profit from its ruins?" "This changes our approach," Chen noted. "If they're planning to mine, they'll have engineers with them, people who might spot our preparations." Samuel paced the room, his mind racing through possibilities. "We need to adjust. Catherine, contact our people in the surrounding settlements. Tell them to spread new rumors, not just about military supplies, but about the old gold deposits. Make it seem like the army's presence is about more than just storage." "Already on it," his daughter replied, heading for the telegraph office. "Marcus, have your scouts pull back a bit. Make it easier for McGraw's observers to get closer. Let them see exactly what we want them to see." The Apache scout nodded, silently disappearing into the night. "Sarah, Chen, rework the explosive charges. We need to make sure that when this goes down, that gold deposit is more trouble than it's worth. Collapse the deep shafts in a way that'll take years to clear." As the others dispersed to their tasks, Sheriff Matthews lingered. "You knew, didn't you, about the gold?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Not for certain, but I remembered something from my marshal days. McGraw never did anything without multiple angles. The terror, the destruction, that's just cover for his real goals. He's building himself a kingdom out here piece by piece, and Providence Station would have been his crown jewel, a secret gold mine right along the railway line, perfect for smuggling ore out of the territory." Samuel checked his Colts one more time. "But he's got one blind spot, always has." "What's that?" "He thinks everyone's as greedy as he is. Can't imagine people fighting for anything but profit." Samuel smiled grimly. "That's why he'll never understand what we're really doing here." Outside, the night wind carried the distant sound of drilling, McGraw's men testing their machines, preparing for an attack that would lead them straight into a trap. But now the trap itself had to be redesigned, made more subtle, more convincing. Samuel walked the station's platform one last time before turning in, noting the positions of his hidden defenders. Each one was a piece in an elaborate game of chess, but the board had just changed. McGraw wasn't just playing for destruction anymore, he was playing for gold. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the schemes of men below. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to their plans. But tonight, the ghost of Tombstone allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. McGraw's greed had revealed his true intentions, and in doing so, had given them the key to his ultimate defeat. Catherine joined her father on the platform, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Think we can pull this off, even with the changes?" Samuel took one of the cups, breathing in the familiar aroma. "Your mother used to say that the best plans are like river water. They find their own way around obstacles." He sipped the hot coffee. "McGraw thinks he's the only one who can adapt, who can play a long game. That's going to be his last mistake." The night deepened around Providence Station, its false facade hiding a deadly trap that grew more elaborate by the hour. And somewhere out there in the darkness, Johnny the Butcher McGraw dreamed of gold, unaware that his greatest weakness, his own calculating greed, was about to become the instrument of his destruction. Dawn painted Providence Station in new hue, shades of fool's gold, a fitting palette for a town built on layers of deception. The morning supply train arrived exactly on schedule, belching steam and coal smoke into the crisp desert air. But today's delivery brought something unexpected: a passenger. The man who stepped onto the platform wore an expensive Eastern suit and carried a leather surveyor's case. He introduced himself as Theodore Winston, representing the Arizona Mining Corporation. Samuel Cooper, watching from the station master's office, immediately recognized the calculated precision in the stranger's movements. "Another one of McGraw's pieces moving into position," he murmured to Catherine, who stood beside him recording the morning's activities in her logbook. "Too obvious," she replied quietly. "The suit's new, but his boots are worn exactly where a holster would rub, and in that surveyor's case, weight's all wrong for instruments." Samuel smiled with pride at his daughter's observation. "Question is, are they getting sloppy, or is this meant to be obvious?" Winston spent the morning making a show of taking measurements and soil samples around the station. His particular interest in the old mining operations wasn't subtle, but his true purpose revealed itself when he requested a meeting with the station's security leadership. Samuel, playing his role as a simple security consultant, joined Sheriff Matthews in the station's office. Winston spread out a series of mining claims and geological surveys, each document a masterwork of forgery. "Gentlemen," Winston began, his accent as carefully manufactured as his appearance, "my employers believe this region's mineral wealth has been vastly underestimated. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for the mining rights." Matthews maintained his practiced look of mild interest. "That's mighty kind, Mr. Winston, but this is a military supply depot now. Mining operations would interfere with security." "About that," Winston smiled, revealing teeth too perfect for a real mining man, "we have certain connections in Washington. The right incentives could see the depot relocated to a more suitable location." The implied bribe hung in the air, like gun smoke. Samuel watched Winston's hands, noting how they never strayed far from the surveyor's case. The man was good. Every gesture calculated to project earnest businessman rather than hired gun. "We'll need time to consider the offer," Samuel said, matching Winston's practiced smile. "Property transfers out here can be complicated. Lots of interested parties to consult." Winston's eyes flickered, a microsecond tell that confirmed Samuel's suspicions. The man wasn't here to broker a deal. He was here to gauge their defenses, to test how deeply their disguise ran. After Winston departed on the afternoon train, the station's hidden command center became a hive of activity. Sarah Hawkins had shadowed the visitor all day, her sniper's eye catching details others might miss. "He measured all the wrong things," she reported, sketching quick diagrams. "Ignored standard survey points, focused instead on structural weak spots. And here," she pointed to several locations, "he spent extra time near our hidden defensive positions. They know something's not right." Marcus Red Cloud materialized from his latest scouting run. 3 riders followed his train north. They're moving faster now, more confident in their paths. The game is changing. Samuel studied the maps covering the walls, each marked with enemy positions and movements. They're accelerating their timeline. Winston's report will confirm their suspicions. We're not what we appear to be. "Isn't that dangerous?" Catherine asked. "If they know it's a trap." "They know something's wrong," Samuel corrected. "But McGraw's ego won't let him believe we've outmaneuvered him. He'll assume we're hiding something valuable enough to justify our deception. The gold story will only reinforce that belief." Thomas Chen entered, carrying fresh telegrams. "Movement at 3 Crosses Ranch. They're breaking camp, moving the drilling machines at night. Our observers count at least 40 men accompanying them." Samuel absorbed this information, his mind reconstructing McGraw's likely strategy. "He's committing his forces earlier than we expected. The question is, what did Winston see that made them change their plans?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Wilson, the town's supposed medical officer, actually a former Army intelligence officer, had been analyzing Winston's movements through his spyglass. "He spent time studying our water tower," Wilson reported, "and the way he handled his case, I'd bet my pension it contained a camera. One of those new Kodak models, small enough to hide but capable of detailed photographs. Samuel's expression darkened. The water tower, of course. He turned to Catherine. Remember what your mother used to say about looking too perfect? Catherine nodded. Makes people suspicious. They look closer, trying to find the flaw. Our water tower's too well maintained. For an abandoned mining town turned military depot. No rust, no leaks, because we need it for the tunnel flooding system. The implications rippled through the command center. Their careful preparation had created an inconsistency, a thread that Winston had pulled. Now McGraw would be looking for others. We need to make it look compromised, Chen suggested. Create some visible damage, maybe a small leak. Make it look like we're trying to hide structural problems. Samuel shook his head. No, we use this. If they're suspicious of the water tower, let's give them a reason to be. Catherine, send word to our people in town. Time to start phase 2. Over. The next hours, Providence Station underwent a subtle transformation. Supply wagons began arriving more frequently, always under heavy guard. Work crews appeared, ostensibly repairing the water tower, but actually making it more obvious as a point of interest. We're not hiding our preparations anymore, Samuel explained to his inner circle. We're flaunting them, but in a way that suggests we're protecting something else entirely. McGraw's people will be so focused on the obvious signs. They'll miss the real trap. Sarah Hawkins, watching through her scope from a hidden position, reported increased activity in the hills. McGraw's observers had grown bolder, moving closer to document the station's suddenly heightened security. As night fell, Samuel met with Matthews and Wilson in the telegraph office. The doctor spread out a series of medical reports, all fabricated, showing concerns about water quality and possible contamination. This ties it all together, Wilson explained. The water tower's not just storage. It's supposedly protecting the town's only clean water source. That's why it's so well maintained, why we guard it so carefully. Matthews nodded approvingly. And McGraw's people will assume we're using water quality as a cover story for something else. Maybe a hidden entrance to the gold deposits or a concealed weapons cache. Exactly, Samuel confirmed. We're not just laying a trap anymore. We're creating a mystery that McGraw's pride won't let him ignore. His own intelligence and paranoia will work against him. Catherine entered with fresh reports from their outlying scouts. The drilling machines are on the move. They've split into 2 groups, one heading this way directly, the other taking a longer route through Apache Pass. Samuel traced both routes on the map. He's planning to hit us from multiple directions, probably thinks he's found our weak point. He turned to his daughter. Time to begin the evacuations, but make it look reluctant, like we're trying to hide it. The night deepened, as Providence Station's elaborate deception entered its final phase. Every piece was in position, every role carefully crafted. Now they could only wait and watch as McGraw's forces drew closer, drawn by a web of lies so intricate that the truth itself had become just another layer of deception. In his private quarters, Samuel cleaned his Colts with practiced precision, each movement a meditation on the coming battle. Catherine found him there, carrying not coffee this time, but a worn leather journal. Found this in the telegraph office archives, she said softly. Records from the original mine. There really is gold down there, Pa. Deep veins that they couldn't reach. Samuel paused in his work. Sometimes, the best lies are built around truth. McGraw's greed will blind him to the obvious, that some things are worth more than gold. Outside, the desert wind carried the distant sound of heavy machinery moving through the night. McGraw's forces were coming, drawn by their own assumptions, and desires into a trap that had become more elaborate than even its creators had initially planned. The ghost of Tombstone allowed himself a grim smile. In all his years of hunting outlaws, he'd learned one crucial truth. The most dangerous trap isn't the one you can see, but the one that plays on what you think you know. McGraw was about to learn that lesson the hard way. A sudden commotion outside drew Samuel and Catherine to the window. One of Marcus Red Cloud's scouts had returned, his horse lathered from hard riding. The Apache scout's news spread through the command center like wildfire. McGraw himself had been spotted, observing Providence Station from Thunder Ridge. "He never shows himself this early," Sarah Hawkins muttered, adjusting her rifle scope to scan the distant heights. "Something's forced his hand." Thomas Chen studied the latest telegraph reports. Railroad schedules are changing. Army patrols increased along the southern routes. He's running out of time and space to operate. "No," Samuel said quietly. "He wants us to think that. Remember what Winston was really looking for, signs of deception. McGraw's putting on a show of his own." Dr. Wilson cleared his throat. "There's something else. That medical report I fabricated about water contamination, just got word there's a real Army medical inspector arriving tomorrow. Seems our little deception caught someone's attention in Tucson." The implications rippled through the room. Their careful lies were beginning to intersect with reality in unpredictable ways. Samuel paced the command center, his mind racing through possibilities. "We can use this," Catherine suggested. "If McGraw's watching, he'll see a real Army inspector. It adds credibility to everything else. Or it exposes us," Matthews countered. "One wrong question to the wrong person." Samuel raised his hand for silence. "We adapt. Wilson, you're now officially our liaison with the Army Medical Corps. Catherine, make sure everyone knows their revised stories. We're not just protecting a water source anymore. We're containing a potential epidemic." "Cholera," Wilson suggested. "It would explain the evacuations, the security, everything." "And if McGraw's people investigate?" Sarah asked from her observation. "Post. They'll find exactly what they expect to find," Samuel smiled. "Chen, those mining chemicals you've been storing." The explosives expert nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "The runoff would contaminate groundwater, show up in tests. We can create evidence of a real health crisis while hiding our actual preparations." As the team dispersed to implement the new layer of deception, Samuel noticed Catherine studying the original mine surveys with unusual intensity. "What is it?" he asked. "These geological reports," she said. "The gold deposits, they're real, but they're not where McGraw thinks they are. The original miners were following the wrong vein." Samuel examined the surveys. His daughter was right. The true mother lode lay in a completely different direction from where they'd been laying their trap. "Nature's playing its own game of deception," he mused. "Question is, do we let McGraw know he's chasing fool's gold, or let him think he's outsmarted us?" "Neither." Catherine's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. "We let him find just enough real gold to convince him he's right, make him commit everything to the wrong location." The plan took shape quickly. Chen and his men would salt specific tunnels with gold traces, creating a convincing trail leading exactly where they wanted McGraw's forces to go. Meanwhile, Sarah's sharpshooters would maintain extra vigilance around the actual gold deposits, making their defensive positions there look like routine patrols. As evening approached, more reports arrived. McGraw's drilling machines were advancing under cover of darkness, but not all was going according to the Outlaws' plan. The Apache tribes, warned by Marcus Red Cloud, had begun their own campaign of disruption, nothing obvious, just enough. Mysterious activity to keep McGraw's men on edge. In the telegraph office, Catherine decoded a message from their observers near Three Crosses Ranch. "McGraw's received word about the Army inspector. He's sending more men, not just gunmen, doctors, mining engineers. He's matching our deception with his own." Samuel absorbed this news with grim satisfaction. He thinks he's calling our bluff, bringing in experts to validate his cover story, while looking for our real weaknesses. "It's becoming real," Matthews observed. "All these layers of deception. How do we keep track of what's true anymore? We don't have to, Samuel replied. Truth is just another weapon now. Every real detail we reveal makes our lies more convincing. Every lie we tell hides 3 truths. Wilson entered with fresh intelligence. McGraw's mining engineers got their descriptions from our people in Tucson. 2 of them worked the California goldfields. They'll know what they're looking at. Good, Samuel surprised them by saying. Let them find real gold. Let them confirm the deposits are valuable. The more convinced they are, the harder McGraw will commit to his attack. The night grew deeper as Providence Station's web of deception expanded, becoming more real with each passing hour. Actual Army patrols now responded to their fabricated health crisis. Real mining experts would soon examine their salted tunnels. The line between truth and deception had become so blurred that even those involved couldn't always tell which was which. Samuel stood on the station platform, watching the stars wheel overhead. He'd spent years trying to leave violence behind, choosing the simple honesty of farming over the complexities of his past. Now here he was, orchestrating a deception so elaborate it had taken on a life of its own. Catherine joined him, her face troubled. Pa, what if we're wrong? What if McGraw sees through everything? Then he'll still be wrong, Samuel replied, because he'll be looking for the lie that confirms what he already believes. And that's the greatest deception of all, letting him think he's figured it out. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of drilling. McGraw's machines. Testing the ground, probing for weaknesses. But even that might be deception. A false advance meant to draw attention from his real movements. The game had become so complex that every move could be a feint, every truth could hide a lie, and every lie could contain a deeper truth. But Samuel Gooper knew that in the end it would come down to something simpler, a test of wills between 2 men who had chosen very different paths in life. Tomorrow would bring more complications, more layers of deception and truth intertwined. But for tonight, the ghost of Tombstone watched over his elaborate trap, knowing that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a drill or even a lie. It's the truth you let your enemy think they've discovered for themselves. The Army. Medical Inspector Major Howard Phillips arrived with the morning train in a cloud of steam and professional authority. His immaculate uniform and precise movements would have been enough to convince anyone of his legitimacy, because they were legitimate. The trap Samuel Cooper had set was now attracting exactly the kind of official attention they'd been trying to simulate. Quite a situation you have here, Phillips remarked, reviewing the fabricated medical reports Dr. Wilson had prepared. Though I must say, your containment procedures seem unusual, robust for a water contamination issue. Samuel, playing his role as security consultant, kept his expression neutral. Can't be too careful out here, Major, especially with the military supply depot to protect. The Major's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, the depot. Interesting coincidence, don't you think? A critical military installation and a potential health crisis in the same remote location. Before Samuel could respond, Catherine burst into the office, her face carefully composed to show just the right amount of concern. Mr. Cooper, sorry to interrupt, but there's been an incident at the South Tunnel. One of the miners... The staged interruption worked perfectly. Phillips immediately shifted into medical response mode, following them to the tunnel entrance where Thomas Chen had prepared their latest piece of theatrical evidence. A miner lay on a stretcher, his face displaying symptoms that would convince any doctor of severe illness. What Phillips couldn't know was that Chen had carefully crafted these symptoms using a combination of harmless chemicals and theatrical makeup. How many others have shown similar symptoms? Phillips demanded, examining. The patient, 3 this week, Wilson replied smoothly. We've quarantined them in the old assay office. As the major hurried off to examine the quarantine setup, Samuel caught movement on the ridge above town. McGraw's observers would be watching this entire performance, drawing exactly the conclusions they'd planned. Sarah Hawkins' voice crackled through the hidden speaking tube near the tunnel entrance. Two riders just left their observation post at full gallop. They're heading north, straight for McGraw's position. Good, Samuel murmured. Let them report what they've seen. Every piece of truth makes our lie more convincing. But the day brought its own unexpected complications. Major Phillips proved to be more thorough than anticipated, requesting water samples from multiple sources and conducting detailed interviews with townspeople. Each layer of scrutiny threatened to expose their deception, yet somehow made it stronger. By late afternoon, Samuel met with his core team in the hidden command center. The walls now displayed updated maps showing McGraw's forces moving steadily, closer, using the cover of medical emergencies to justify their approach. Phillips is convinced we're dealing with a real health crisis, Wilson reported. He's already telegraphed Tucson, recommending additional medical personnel and supplies, which gives McGraw perfect cover to move more men into position, Catherine added. His medical volunteers are already on their way, at least 20 men, all carrying suspicious amounts of equipment for doctors. Marcus Red Cloud materialized from his latest scouting run. The drilling machines move only at night now, but they're being assembled differently, smaller units, more mobile. They've learned from Salvation's Creek. Samuel studied the maps intently. Something about the pattern of McGraw's movements bothered him. They're adapting too perfectly, he said finally. Every move we make, they counter with exactly the right response. Isn't that what we wanted? Matthews asked. To make them think they've figured out our game. Yes, but... Samuel traced the enemy positions with his finger. McGraw's a butcher, not a surgeon. These movements are too precise, too calculated. Sarah Hawkins lowered her rifle scope, having completed another survey of the surrounding hills. You think he's got help? Someone with military training? More than that. Samuel pulled out an old wanted poster from his martial days. Remember Colonel Victor Kane? Led that Confederate holdout group causing trouble in Texas? Recognition dawned on several faces. Kane had been a brilliant military strategist who turned to organizing criminal enterprises after the war. His signature was complex operations disguised as something else entirely. Last I heard, Kane was dead, Matthews said. Killed in a border skirmish. Last I heard, I was dead too, Samuel reminded him. Kane disappeared right after McGraw started gathering his army. That's no coincidence. This changed everything. Kane was known for turning his opponent's strengths against them, for building plans within plans. If he was working with McGraw, Catherine was already ahead of him. The water contamination story, it's exactly the kind of cover Kane would recognize. He might even suspect we're using his own tactics against him. Which means every move we've made, Chen began, has told him exactly what he needed to know, Samuel finished. Not about what we're hiding, but about how we think. The implications rippled through the command center. Their elaborate deception hadn't just attracted McGraw's attention, it had drawn the interest of someone who specialized in exactly this kind of strategic warfare. A telegram arrived from their observers near Three Crosses Ranch. Catherine decoded it quickly, her face growing pale. Large shipment just arrived. Not mining equipment this time, military-grade explosives enough to level a mountain. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. Kane's involvement explained the precision of McGraw's responses, the way each move seemed perfectly calculated. But it also meant gold was never the real target, he said quietly. Kane doesn't care about wealth. He wants to make statements. Providence Station isn't just a rich prize to him. It's a chance to demonstrate how vulnerable every town in the territory really is. by destroying the one place that's supposedly under full military protection, Matthews understood, making everyone lose faith in the army's ability to defend them. And McGraw gets the gold as payment for helping Kane spread his message of chaos, Catherine added. It's a perfect partnership. Samuel moved to the map wall, studying the positions with new understanding. Every defensive measure they'd taken, every layer of deception they'd created, Kane would see them as pieces in a larger game. We need to change the rules, he declared. Kane expects us to think like soldiers, to defend this position according to military doctrine, so we do the opposite. What do you mean? Sarah asked from her observation post. We abandon the station. The suggestion hit like a thunderbolt. Everyone began talking at once until Samuel raised his hand for silence. Not really abandon it, he explained, but make it look like we're pulling out. Kane will expect us to dig in, to fortify our position. Instead, we give him an apparently empty target. And spring our trap when he's committed to taking it, Catherine caught on. But Pa, what about the real army personnel, Phillips and his men? They become part of our defense, Samuel said, but not the way Kane would expect. Wilson, how long would it take to stage a complete medical evacuation? The doctor considered. With Phillips' help, believing it's real, we could clear the town by tomorrow night. Do it, but make it messy, panicked, like we've lost control of the situation. Samuel turned to Matthews. Jim, get word to our people in the surrounding towns. I want every wild rumor, every fearful story about plague and contamination spreading across the territory. Kane will see through it, Sarah warned. Count on it, Samuel agreed. But he'll have to wonder, are we creating a cover story for our retreat, or is our retreat a cover story for something else? The more he analyzes our moves, the more he'll second-guess himself. As the team dispersed to implement the new strategy, Catherine lingered. This is a big gamble, Pa. If we're wrong about Kane, we're not. Samuel checked his Colts with practiced efficiency. Kane's reputation is built on turning traps back on those who set them, so we give him exactly what he expects, a trap so obvious he'll think he's clever for spotting it. While the real trap is something neither Jane nor McGraw would ever expect. Samuel smiled grimly. Sometimes the best way to catch a man who overthinks everything is to make the solution insultingly simple. Night fell over Providence Station as the new plan took shape. Lights burned in the command center, where Sam's team worked to dismantle their elaborate deception and replace it with something far riskier. The truth, carefully disguised as a lie. In the distance, they could hear McGraw's drilling machines being positioned, their mechanical sounds carrying through the desert air like the growls of approaching predators. But now, those sounds hold a different meaning. Each move their enemies made revealed more about the men making them, about the assumptions that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The ghost of Tombstone had built his legend on being unpredictable, on appearing where he was least expected. Now he would reinvent that legend one last time, using his enemy's own intelligence and caution as weapons against them. As the command center cleared out, Sarah Hawkins remained at her observation post, her experienced hunter's eyes catching something odd in the gathering darkness. Movement on the northwest ridge, she reported. Different pattern than McGraw's men. Samuel joined her at the window, borrowing her spyglass. Through the powerful lens, he caught glimpses of figures moving with military precision, not making any effort to hide their presence. Kane's sending us a message, he realized. Let us see his men to make sure we know he's involved. Catherine, reviewing the latest intelligence report, suddenly straightened. Pa, look at this. She spread out a series of telegrams. Supply orders from the surrounding towns. Everyone's requesting medical supplies, preparing for possible contamination. But these quantities, Samuel studied the orders. They're building stockpiles. Kane's influence is spreading faster than we anticipated. He's using our health crisis as cover to position resources across the territory. Thomas Chen entered with more troubling news. Just intercepted a coded message. McGraw's men aren't just bringing explosives. They've got enough mining equipment to outfit 3 full operations. Kane's thinking is bigger than Providence. Station, Samuel concluded. He's setting up a network. Once this town falls, he'll have staging areas ready throughout the territory. The implications were staggering. Kane wasn't just helping McGraw. He was using this operation as a template, preparing to replicate it anywhere the army maintains strategic positions. Dr. Wilson burst into his grave. We've got another problem. Major Phillips is requesting Army engineers. Says the water contamination might be coming from structural damage to the old mining tunnels. That works in our favor, Catherine suggested. More official activity makes our cover story stronger. No, Samuel shook his head. Kane will expect that reaction from us. We need to do something he won't anticipate. He turned to Matthews. Jim, remember that Ranger operation in El Paso? The Spanish gold shipment? The sheriff's eyes lit up with understanding. When we leaked the wrong route on purpose, made it so obvious they thought it had to be true. Exactly, we don't try to. Stop Phillips from discovering our deceptions. We help him find them, but not all of them, and not in the way Kane would expect. The plan came together quickly. They would allow Phillips to uncover evidence of their military supply depot deception, making him think he'd found their real secret. Meanwhile, they would appear to be frantically hiding something else entirely. Marcus Red Cloud materialized. From the shadows, my scouts report Kane's men are establishing their own observation posts, very organized, very thorough. Good, Samuel smiled. Let them be thorough. Every hour they spend analyzing our movements is an hour they're not looking for the real threat. Sarah Hawkins lowered her rifle, a thought striking her. The Army engineers Phillips requested, Kane will have men ready to infiltrate their ranks. Count on it, Samuel agreed. So we give them something special to find. Chen, remember those mining reports you forged? Time to make them real. The explosives expert grinned. You want me to salt the tunnels, make it look like we're hiding evidence of serious structural damage? Not hiding it, revealing it accidentally. Make it seem like we're trying to cover up negligence rather than protect a military secret. Catherine caught on quickly. Kane will think we're creating a cover story to evacuate the town without revealing the depot's true purpose. And McGraw will push harder, Matthews added, thinking we're about to abandon valuable military supplies. While Kane, Samuel finished, will be trying to figure out why we want him to think exactly that. The night deepened as they implemented the new strategy. Supply wagons began moving out, but not in the panicked rush that would be expected in a true evacuation. Instead, they moved with deliberate inefficiency, as if trying to appear more organized than they really were. Dr. Wilson arranged for Phillips to accidentally discover discrepancies in the medical reports, discrepancies that hinted at broader problems but revealed nothing concrete. Each piece of evidence was calculated to raise more questions than it answered. Around midnight, a commotion erupted at the South Tunnel. One of Chen's carefully planned accidents revealed apparent structural damage that threatened the entire underground system. Phillips immediately requested additional engineering surveys, playing right into their hands. Kane's watching all of this, Samuel mused from his observation post. He's seeing exactly what we want him to see, a complex deception falling, apart under official scrutiny. And that's what makes him dangerous, Catherine reminded them. He'll be looking for the pattern, trying to understand our real purpose. Which is why our real purpose has to be something no strategic genius would ever consider, Samuel smiled. Sometimes the simplest answer is the one people like Kane are least likely to believe. As dawn approached, Samuel gathered his core team. One last time. The next phase would require perfect coordination and timing. Each person had their role, their part in the elaborate dance of deception and revelation that would draw Kane and McGraw into their trap. Remember, he told them, Kane expects layers of deception. He'll analyze every move, looking for the hidden meaning. Our job is to make him keep looking, keep thinking, until it's too late to realize that sometimes... He checked his Colts. With practiced hands, a trap is just a trap. The first light of morning revealed Providence Station in apparent disarray. Medical teams moved with urgent purpose, engineers examined structural damage with grave concern, and supply wagons continued their inefficient evacuation. Every piece of the performance was calculated to tell a story. Not the story Kane would expect, but the one that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Samuel watched the activity from the station's tower, noting the positions of Kane's observers. In the hills, the greatest challenge in deceiving a master strategist wasn't in hiding the truth, but in making the truth seem like just another layer of deception. Kane would expect complexity, wheels within wheels. He would never suspect that beneath all the elaborate misdirection lay something as simple as a father protecting his territory, a lawman upholding justice, and a community refusing to be broken by terror and treachery. The evacuation of Providence Station was in full swing when the first real cracks in their deception appeared. It came not from Kane's strategic analysis or McGraw's brutal tactics, but from an unexpected source, Major Phillips's young assistant, Lieutenant David Foster. Foster had been methodically reviewing water samples when he noticed something that more experienced eyes had missed. The contamination patterns didn't match natural spread. More importantly, they didn't match artificial spread either. They formed a perfect grid, as if someone had deliberately planted traces of contamination at mathematically precise intervals. Major Phillips, Foster's voice carried across the station yard. "Sir, you need to see this." Samuel, watching from the telegraph office, saw Kane's observers on the ridge suddenly focus their attention on the young lieutenant. This wasn't part of their plan. "Catherine," he called quietly, "how good are Wilson's fake medical records?" "Good. Enough to fool most doctors," she replied. "But if someone starts looking at the actual samples..." They didn't have to finish the thought. Foster's discovery threatened to unravel everything before they were ready. But as Samuel moved to intervene, he noticed something else, a subtle change in the pattern of movement among Kane's men on the ridge. "Hold," he ordered, raising his hand to stop Catherine from implementing damage control. "Watch their reactions." Through his spyglass, Samuel could see Kane's observers sending urgent signals. They'd spotted Foster's discovery, but their response wasn't what he expected. Instead of triumphant recognition of exposed deception, their movement suggested confusion, even concern. "They think it's another layer," Samuel realized, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Kane's so convinced of our complexity that he sees traps within traps, even when there aren't any," Catherine caught on quickly. "So, when Foster exposes the contamination as artificial, Kane assumes it's deliberate. A planted discovery meant to make him question everything else. The irony was perfect. Their deception was being exposed, but Kane's own strategic paranoia made him discount the exposure as yet another deception. Sometimes the truth was the best disguise of all. Major Phillips gathered his staff to examine Foster's findings, their animated discussion clearly visible to the observers on the ridge. Samuel used the distraction to gather his core team in the hidden command center. "Kane's overthinking everything now," he explained, pointing to the latest movement reports. "His men are pulling back, establishing wider observation perimeters. He's looking for the pattern behind the pattern." Sarah Hawkins nodded from her position. "They're second-guessing every move. Even McGraw's men are getting jumpy, spreading out, losing their tight formation." "Perfect," Samuel smiled. Time for the next phase. Catherine, send the signal to our people in town. Chen, start the tunnel work. Matthews, get word to the army patrols. Exactly as we discussed. The plan unfolded like a complex dance. As Foster's discovery prompted Phillips to launch a more thorough investigation, the town's remaining residents began acting out elaborately choreographed roles. Some fled in apparent panic, spreading wild rumors about secret military experiments. Others stubbornly refused to leave, hinting at hidden knowledge of valuable deposits still untapped in the mines. Kane's observers reported it all, their messages, becoming increasingly confused as they tried to separate truth from deception. Each piece of evidence contradicted the last, creating a web of uncertainty that paralyzed their decision-making. But Samuel hadn't counted on McGraw's impatience. The outlaw leader, frustrated by Kane's analytical delays, decided to force the issue. His men began moving the drilling machines into position under cover of darkness, ignoring Kane's signals to wait. McGraw's breaking formation, Marcus Redcloud reported, materializing from his scouting run. His men are splitting into smaller groups, approaching from multiple directions. Samuel studied the map, noting how McGraw's forces were spreading out. He thinks we're too busy with the evacuation to notice. Kane's probably trying to stop him, but McGraw's greed is stronger than his caution. Should we adjust the plan? Catherine asked, marking the new enemy positions. No, Samuel decided. This works in our favor. Kane will be forced to support McGraw's move, even though he knows it's premature. His own reputation won't let him appear indecisive. The night deepened as McGraw's forces crept closer to Providence Station. Their movement was skilled, but not perfect. The coordination that Kane's influence had provided was breaking down under the strain of McGraw's ambition. In the command center, Samuel's team tracked every approach. Sarah's sharpshooters maintained their positions, invisible in the darkness. Chen's engineers finished their final preparations in the tunnels. Everything was ready. Then came the moment Samuel had been waiting for. Kane himself appeared on Thunder Ridge, his military bearing unmistakable even at a distance. Through high-powered glasses, they could see him arguing with McGraw, their gestures heated and angry. Dissension in the ranks, Matthews observed with satisfaction. More than that, Samuel corrected. Kane's realizing he's lost control. Everything he's built, all his careful planning is being undone by McGraw's impatience. And that's when men like Kane make mistakes. As if to prove his point, Kane's next move played directly into their hands. Unable to stop McGraw's advance, he tried to regain control by overly complicating it. His signals directed McGraw's men into elaborate approach patterns, turning a simple attack into a complex military operation. He's trying to salvage his strategy, Catherine noted, watching through her own glasses. Make McGraw's reckless charge look like part of the plan. And burning time they don't have, Samuel added. Dawn's coming. Soon they'll lose their cover of darkness. The first light of morning revealed Providence Station apparently vulnerable. Its defenses scattered by the evacuation. McGraw's men had reached their initial positions, the drilling machines primed and ready. Kane's observers maintained their wide perimeter, still searching for hidden threats that didn't exist. That's when Samuel unveiled the final piece of his plan. As the sun created the horizon, multiple wagon trains appeared on the surrounding roads, not fleeing the station, but converging on it. Each wagon flew the U.S. Army flag. Legitimate. Army patrols. Matthews grinned. Right on schedule. Kane immediately recognized the trap, but it was too late. His own complicated strategic approach had scattered McGraw's forces too widely to retreat effectively. They were caught in the open, their drilling machines now obvious targets on the landscape, but Samuel wasn't done. As Kane and McGraw struggled to respond to the Army's approach, the town's apparent evacuation reversed itself. Armed men emerged. From hiding places throughout Providence Station, many wearing army uniforms that had been concealed beneath civilian clothes. "You see, Kane," Samuel murmured, watching the strategist's reaction through his spyglass. "Sometimes the best trap is the one you build in plain sight. While you were looking for hidden meanings, we were showing you exactly what we planned. A legitimate military operation disguised as a cover-up, disguised as a legitimate military operation." The truth of their deception finally dawned on Kane. Every layer he'd uncovered, every pattern he'd analyzed, had led him exactly where they wanted him to be. His own strategic genius had become a weakness, making him dismiss the simple truth in favor of seeking deeper complexity. McGraw, realizing too late that his position was compromised, tried to salvage the situation the only way he knew how, with violence. His men opened fire on the approaching army patrols, turning a potential retreat into a battle they couldn't win. Kane's observers began abandoning their posts, their carefully maintained network of surveillance collapsing as each man chose survival over strategy. The master strategist himself stood motionless on Thunder Ridge, watching his elaborate plans crumble in the face of a truth too simple to believe. Samuel turned to his team, his voice carrying the weight of imminent victory. "Send the signal. It's time to show them what Providence Station really is. Not a trap disguised as a town, but a town that became a trap because of the people willing to defend it." As the sun climbed higher, the final act of their deception began to unfold. But this time, there would be no layers of mystery, no strategic complexity. Sometimes, Samuel knew, the most devastating truth is the one hiding in plain sight, waiting for clever men to outsmart themselves trying to uncover it. The battle erupted in stages, each revelation bringing new chaos to McGraw's forces. The drilling. Machines, positioned for maximum effect against the town's supposed weak points, now sat exposed and vulnerable on the open ground. Kane's carefully planned defensive positions, spread too thin in his search for hidden threats, couldn't provide adequate cover. "First waves moving in," Sarah reported from her elevated position. "McGraw's men are trying to reach the drilling. Machines, should I take the shot?" "Not yet," Samuel ordered. "Let them commit fully to the attack. Kane's still holding some forces in reserve." He was right. Through his spyglass, Samuel could see Kane frantically signaling his remaining men, trying to organize a strategic retreat. But McGraw, driven by desperation and greed, had other plans. "Pa!" Catherine's voice carried from the telegraph office. "McGraw's sending signals to his rear guard. He's ordering them to use the explosives." This was the moment Samuel had been waiting for. "Chen, light the beacons." Suddenly, signal fires blazed to life on every surrounding hilltop. What Kane and McGraw had assumed were simple observation posts revealed themselves as Apache warrior positions. Marcus Red Cloud's people had kept their word. The escape routes Kane had so carefully scouted were now blocked by silent, deadly warriors. "They're caught between three forces," Matthews observed. "Army patrols to the north, our town defenders, and the Apache to the south. Kane's worst nightmare, a simple trap with nowhere to maneuver." McGraw's response was predictably brutal. He ordered his men to concentrate fire on the town's water tower, still believing it held the key to their original plan. The structure took heavy damage, but instead of catastrophic failure, it merely leaked in precise, pre-planned patterns. Chen's reinforcement work held, Catherine noted with satisfaction. "The water's flowing exactly where we wanted it." Samuel watched as the carefully channeled water began pooling around the drilling machines, turning the ground to mud and compromising their stability. Kane, seeing the danger, tried to order an immediate withdrawal, but it was too late. The heavy machines were already sinking into the softened earth. "Now, Sarah," Samuel commanded, "take the shots." The sharp crack of her Sharps rifle echoed across the battlefield. With surgical precision, she disabled the drilling machine's pressure gauges one by one. Steam erupted from the damaged equipment, creating an obscuring cloud that added to the confusion. Kane, his strategic genius now working against him, began seeing threats in every shadow. His remaining forces split further, trying to cover too many possibilities at once. This was exactly what Samuel had planned for. Signal the army. "Patrols," he ordered. "Standard encirclement pattern, nothing fancy. Let's see how Kane handles simplicity." The military units began a textbook maneuver, one so basic it would be taught to first-year cadets. Kane's men, expecting some clever twist, hesitated in their response. That moment of doubt was all the soldiers needed to close the trap. McGraw, watching his forces crumble, made one last desperate gambit. He led a charge toward the town's main entrance, hoping to force his way through to the supposed military supplies. His men followed, more afraid of their leader's wrath than the defenders' guns. "Here they come," Matthews announced, his voice steady. "Right up Main Street, just like we planned." Samuel raised his hand, waiting for the perfect moment. The charging. Outlaws passed the first row of buildings, then the second. McGraw, driven by visions of victory, never noticed that his men were being channeled into an ever-narrowing corridor. "Now," Samuel commanded, "show them the truth about Providence Station." The buildings on either side of Main Street suddenly transformed. False fronts dropped away, revealing fortified positions. Windows that had seemed randomly boarded up became perfect gun ports. Every architectural flaw they had let Kane's men document now served a deadly purpose. "You were right, Pa," Catherine said softly, watching through her glasses. "Kane was so busy looking for hidden defenses, he never realized the town itself was the defense. The trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. Caught in a killing zone of their own choice, McGraw's men found themselves under fire from every direction. The simple, obvious truth of their situation was far more effective than any complex deception could have been. Kane, watching his strategic masterpiece dissolve into chaos, made his final mistake. Rather than accept defeat, he committed his reserve forces in a desperate bid to rescue McGraw. It was exactly the move Samuel had predicted, a proud man's refusal to admit he'd been outplayed. "Signal Marcus," Samuel ordered. "The second phase begins now." The Apache warriors, who had remained eerily silent throughout the battle, suddenly erupted in war cries that echoed off the canyon walls. The psychological effect on Kane's men was immediate. Trained to expect military tactics, they found themselves facing an enemy that operated on entirely different principles. Then came the final revelation. The town's supposed evacuation reversed itself one last time. Every civilian who had fled in apparent panic now returned, armed and ready. The refugees Kane had discounted as simple townspeople revealed themselves as experienced fighters. "You see, Kane," Samuel murmured, watching the strategist's face through his spyglass. "A town isn't just buildings and defenses. It's people. People willing to fight for their homes, their future. That's the truth you never understood." The battle's outcome was now inevitable. Caught between conventional forces they couldn't outfight and unconventional enemies they couldn't outthink, McGraw's army began to surrender in groups. The complex operation that had taken months to plan unraveled in less than an hour. But Samuel kept his focus on Kane. The strategist had one last card to play, he always did. The question was whether his pride would let him fold or force him to make one final fatal move in a game he'd already lost. The dust of battle hadn't yet settled when Colonel Victor Kane made his final move. It came not with the strategic brilliance he was famous for, but with a desperate brutality that caught everyone by surprise. As his forces surrendered around him, Kane detonated explosives hidden throughout Thunder Ridge, sending an avalanche of rock and debris toward Providence Station. The buildings on either side of Main Street suddenly transformed. False fronts dropped away, revealing fortified positions. Windows that had seemed randomly boarded up became perfect gun ports. Every architectural flaw they had let Kane's men document now served a deadly purpose. "You were right, Pa," Catherine said softly, watching through her glasses. Kane was so busy looking for hidden defenses, he never realized the town itself was the defense. The trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. Caught in a killing zone of their own choice, McGraw's men found themselves under fire from every direction. The simple, obvious truth of their situation was far more effective than any complex deception could have been. Kane, watching his strategic masterpiece dissolve into chaos, made his final mistake. Rather than accept defeat, he committed his reserve forces in a desperate bid to rescue McGraw. It was exactly the move Samuel had predicted, a proud man's refusal to admit he'd been outplayed. "Signal Marcus," Samuel ordered. "The second phase begins now." The Apache warriors, who had remained eerily silent throughout the battle, suddenly erupted in war cries that echoed off the canyon walls. The psychological effect on Kane's men was immediate. Trained to expect military tactics, they found themselves facing an enemy that operated on entirely different principles. Then came the final revelation. The town's supposed evacuation reversed itself one last time. Every civilian who had fled in apparent panic now returned, armed and ready. The refugees Kane had discounted as simple townspeople revealed themselves as experienced fighters. "You." "See, Kane," Samuel murmured, watching the strategist's face through his spyglass. "A town isn't just buildings and defenses. It's people. People willing to fight for their homes, their future. That's the truth you never understood." The battle's outcome was now inevitable. Caught between conventional forces they couldn't outfight and unconventional enemies they couldn't outthink, McGraw's army began to surrender in groups. The complex operation that had taken months to plan unraveled in less than an hour. But Samuel kept his focus on Kane. The strategist had one last card to play. He always did. The question was whether his pride would let him fold or force him to make one final fatal move in a game he'd already lost. The dust of battle hadn't yet settled when Colonel Victor Kane made his final move. It came not with the strategic brilliance he was famous for, but with a desperate brutality that caught everyone by surprise. As his forces surrendered around him, Kane detonated explosives hidden throughout Thunder Ridge, sending an avalanche of rock and debris toward Providence Station. "East side of town, everyone move!" Samuel's voice cut through the chaos, but as townspeople fled the approaching destruction, he noticed something worse. Catherine was missing. Through the settling gun smoke, Samuel spotted his daughter near the telegraph office, desperately trying to save crucial intelligence documents. The avalanche's path would hit that building first. "She's not going to make it," Sarah Hawkins called from her position, already calculating trajectories with a sniper's precision. Samuel's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. The carefully maintained control that had served him through the battle dissolved in the face of pure paternal fear. The ghost of Tombstone had faced countless enemies, but never one that threatened his own flesh and blood. "Chen!" he shouted. "The mining charges, now!" The explosives expert hesitated for a split second. "Those are our last line of defense. If we use them now—" "Do it!" Chen's precisely placed charges detonated in sequence, creating a counterforce that split the avalanche's path. Most of the debris would now miss the town center, but the telegraph office remained in danger. Samuel ran toward his daughter, his legendary speed pushing against the limits of human capability. Time seemed to slow as he processed every detail. The angle of the falling rocks, the distance to Catherine, the odds of survival. Through his peripheral vision, he caught movement on Thunder Ridge. Kane wasn't just watching his handiwork. He was using the chaos to cover his escape. The strategist had planned this final gambit carefully, ensuring he had a clear route even as he tried to bury the town that had outsmarted him. "Pa, the documents!" Catherine called out as Samuel reached her. "Everything we have on McGraw's network, leave. Them!" He grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. "We can't. This is evidence of corruption throughout the territory. Names, dates, locations." A massive boulder crashes through the telegraph office's roof, sending splinters flying. Samuel made the choice any father would, wrapping himself around Catherine as debris rained down around them. But fate, or perhaps Catherine's mother's guardian angel, intervened. The building structure held just long enough for them to reach safety, though the precious documents were lost beneath tons of rock. As the dust began to settle, Samuel faced his first real internal conflict of the day. Kane was escaping, using routes that had been carefully prepared in advance. The strategist's horse was fast, but Samuel knew he could catch him if he left now. "Go," Catherine said, reading his expression. "I'm fine. Kane can't escape. Not after this." Samuel hesitated. The father in him wanted to stay, to ensure his daughter was truly safe, but the lawman knew Kane's escape would mean more violence, more communities threatened by his particular brand of strategic terror. "Marcus!" he called. Out. The Apache scout materialized from the chaos. "Protect her!" Without waiting for a response, Samuel ran for his horse. The pursuit that followed would become legend in the territory, though not for the reasons most would expect. Kane's escape. Route led east toward a series of box canyons that any sensible man would avoid. But Samuel had learned that Kane's strategies often involved using terrain others would dismiss. Sure enough, as he followed the strategist's trail, Samuel discovered an elaborate network of prepared positions, supply caches, false trails, and carefully planned ambush points. Kane had prepared for every contingency except one, the simple determination of a man who had spent decades learning these canyons. The chase led them through increasingly treacherous terrain. Kane's horse was fresher, but Samuel's paint knew these paths. Every time Kane tried to implement some complex evasion pattern, Samuel countered with direct pursuit. Finally, the strategist's mount stumbled on a loose scree slope, forcing Kane to continue on foot. The colonel's military bearing remained intact, even as he scrambled up a narrow trail toward what he clearly believed was another prepared position. Samuel dismounted, drawing one of his Colts. "It's over, Victor. No more strategies, no more plans." Kane's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "It's never over, Cooper. You think Providence Station was my only operation? I have men positioned throughout the territory, ready to implement contingency plans you can't even imagine." "Had men," Samuel corrected, advancing steadily. "While you were busy with your avalanche, army patrols were arresting your network. All those careful preparations, all those backup plans, they're gone." Something in his voice must have conveyed the truth, because Kane's composed facade cracked slightly. "Impossible. My codes were unbreakable. My men were loyal." "Your codes were complex, but not unbreakable. Your men were loyal until they realized you'd sacrifice them without hesitation. That's the problem with building everything on strategy, Victor. Eventually, people see through to the empty core." Kane reached his prepared position, a natural alcove stocked with weapons and supplies. But as he moved to arm himself, his expression changed from confidence to confusion. The cache had been emptied. "Looking for these?" Samuel held up a handful of cartridges. "Catherine found your supply network maps in those documents you tried to bury. Apache scouts cleared out your caches days ago." The strategist's face twisted with rage. "The avalanche should have killed her. All my calculations—" "That's your weakness, Victor. You calculate everything except the human heart. A father's love for his daughter. A community's willingness to fight for its home. The simple truths that no strategy can overcome." Cain drew his pistol with military precision, but Samuel was faster. The Colt's report echoed through the canyon, sending Cain's weapon spinning away. "You won't take me alive," Cain snarled, reaching for a hidden derringer. "I won't rot in some territorial prison surrounded by common criminals." Samuel's second shot knocked the backup weapon from Cain's grasp, along with two of his fingers. The strategist fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding hand. "You don't get to choose, Victor. Providence Station wasn't just about stopping McGraw's operation. It was about showing the territory that men like you can be beaten, that all your clever plans and complex strategies can't stand against simple justice." As Samuel bound Cain's wounds and secured him for transport, he reflected on the day's events. The battle had been won not through superior strategy or force of arms, but through the strength of a community united against terror. Providence Station had become something Cain could never understand, a place where people stood together, where simple truths overcame complex lies. The ride back to town was silent, Cain's proud bearing diminished by more than just his wounds. Every few miles they passed army patrols, escorting prisoners, McGraw's men, and Cain's operatives, their elaborate network of terror reduced to nothing more than criminals facing justice. Providence Station came into view as the sun began to set. The town had already begun clearing the avalanche debris, its people working together just as they had fought together. Catherine ran to meet them, her face showing relief that quickly turned to steel when she saw Cain. "The documents survived," she reported. "Most of them, anyway, enough to unravel whatever's left of his organization." Cain's expression remained carefully neutral, but Samuel caught the slight flinch that proved the impact of her words. The strategist's greatest weapon, information, was now turned against him. "Take him to the army detention wagon," Samuel instructed the waiting soldiers. "Full security protocols. He may be wounded, but his mind is still dangerous." As Cain was led away, Catherine touched her father's arm. "You're bleeding." Samuel looked down, surprised to see several cuts and bruises he hadn't noticed in the heat of pursuit. "Your mother always said I never felt the wounds until the fight was over." "The fight's not over, though, is it?" Catherine's eyes tracked Cain's departure. His networks, his prepared positions throughout the territory. "No," Samuel agreed, "but we've shown people how to fight back. Sometimes the biggest victory isn't in defeating the enemy, but in showing others that the enemy can be defeated." The town bell rang, calling people to a community meeting. As they walked toward the gathering, Samuel reflected on how this day had changed everything. The ghost of Tombstone's legend would grow, but not for the reasons people might expect. His greatest victory hadn't come from speed with a gun or tactical brilliance, but from understanding that the simplest truths were often the most powerful weapons against men who lived by deception. That day in Providence Station marked the end of an era for the Arizona Territory. The legend of Samuel Cooper, once known as the Ghost of Tombstone, took on new meaning, not as a deadly gunslinger, but as a protector who showed that the strongest weapon against terror wasn't guns or strategy, but the united will of ordinary people standing together. His victory over McGraw and Cain became a symbol of hope, proving that even the most elaborate schemes could be defeated by simple truth and unwavering courage. As Samuel Cooper returned to his farm with Catherine, he knew the territory would face new challenges, but something fundamental had changed. The ghost of Tombstone had finally found peace, not by running from his past, but by using it to forge a better future. In the end, the most dangerous man in the West had become its greatest guardian, teaching others that true strength lies not in violence or fear, but in the bonds of community and the courage to stand against injustice, no matter the odds. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.